Test, test, test. Ja? Oops. Hello, welcome everyone. Can you hear me back there? We have a full room today, so I'm going to ask you not to be shy. You can come here to the front. And if you have a free seat next to you somewhere in the middle, maybe put up your hand so that people can see. There are still some seats here in the front row. Here, there are two. Oui. Test, test. Hello everyone, welcome to the EEA Seminar. We always host this seminar twice a year here at the EFTA Secretariat. This really is at the heart of what EFTA is all about. EFTA was founded in 1960, so we are celebrating our 65 years, but we are not any close to retiring. We are an organization that is built around European integration. Back in the 1960s, obviously it's the post-war era, and EFTA is built on as an alternative model to the European community, because we are not a supranational organization, meaning that our member states, they are really at the core of all of our decisions. We had 7 founding members, and currently we have 4, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway and Switzerland. And EFTA's role is really threefold. We manage the relations between our members, that is done through the EFTA Convention. We are also very proud to be able to say that we have a network of 35 free trade agreements with 49 partners. And I'm looking at my TRD, the trade colleagues here. They sent a scout, actually. They have a spy to make sure that I don't mess up the figures. And this is a network that we are very proud of. Especially in today's environment, we can say that EFTA has concluded 7 new agreements since 2022. We updated our agreements with Chile and Ukraine. And we have signed new agreements with Kosovo, with India, with Malaysia, with Mercosur just last week. We're signing an updated agreement today, this afternoon, with Singapore, where we are adding a digital economy agreement to our existing one with Singapore. Why am I highlighting this? Because I think it is important in today's environment that it is possible to work together. It is possible to find compromises, to negotiate for the benefits of both parties. And at the heart of today's discussion, the third sort of part of EFTA's work is European and EEA collaboration. Now, we can imagine a world where the European community and the predecessor of the EU was there on one hand, and EFTA with Britain and other countries as an alternative model, that these two would have competed against each other, but they did not. They worked very closely together, which culminated in Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway joining the internal market, signed in 1992, came into force in 1994, and Switzerland, our 4th member, having very strong relations with the EU through bilateral agreements. And we are not extras to the internal market. This is an internal market of 30 states. And there's quite a lot of work to make sure that we have a homogeneous market that can compete in today's environment and stays relevant. And that is why it's a great pleasure to see that we have 130 people here in the room. We have over 100 people with us online. I'd say to those online, I hope you have a coffee or 2. We've certainly filled up here because it's going to be a bit intense. It does get technical. I have a philosophy background. This is not my area of expertise. But at the foundation of all of this is how do we make sure that these 30 states can work together and that our internal market stays sound as the foundation of our collaboration. So we're going to talk about the political, we're going to talk about the technical, you're going to hear from the EU side and you're going to hear from the EEA side. And to start us off, I'm very pleased to have with us Marit, Schage, Andria. She is the director of our internal market directorate or division here at the EFTA Secretariat. She is Norwegian, but she's married to an Italian, so she speaks fast. So, to kick us off, please welcome Marit.
Thank you. Well, some of us in the family has to speak fast. It's not the Italian in our case, but anyway. I will try to make it so that everyone will understand, and please don't hesitate to think of questions and because we will have a session a bit later on. First of all, a really, really warm welcome to all of you. It's always nice to fill up this room and to talk and teach a bit about the EEA agreement. I am always especially pleased, no offense for those who are the same age as me, to see all the young people in the room, because this is what we relate to. This is what many of you are born with. So I'm just going to try and... do I get that one? No. Yeah. Thank you. I will give you a brief introduction to the agreement and the framework, and throughout the day we will have several speakers, several sessions that will further deepen this knowledge of you, of ours, so that we want to share with you today. So I think with that, I will just kick off. Just a few words of me. I was introduced by my name, Marit, and I am the director of this division, Internal Market Division, that is the one handling all the acquis that goes into the EEA agreement. We are in total 25 people, so even if that sounds like many, it's not so many for this huge agreement, but we are of course supported and working closely with member states and also with the EU side. So, first of all, the EFTA Secretariat in Brussels. We have maybe, as you know, or if you don't know, we have three duty stations in EFTA. We have the headquarters in Geneva, and then we have the Statistical Corporation in Luxembourg, and here in Brussels is the Secretariat, and we are mainly handling the EEA agreement. First of all, we are a secretariat for the EFTA states in their EEA work, the so-called EEA process, or legally speaking, the incorporation process. This also includes a lot of coordination of the collaboration between the EEA EFTA states and with the European Commission. We are also the secretariat of the EEA advisory bodies, the EEA EFTA Parliamentary Committee, and the Consultative Committee. These are two bodies that you will hear more about later on, because my excellent colleague Ingerid will take you through that. So I will leave your curiosity for a bit longer. The EEA agreement. I am going to say a bit about why we have it, what it is, how it works, and what it is not about. And then I always find it useful to start about the objectives and the principle of the agreement. But because the principle was meant to establish a dynamic and homogeneous European economical area based on common rules and equal conditions of competition and providing for the adequate means of enforcement at judicial level. The last part is the EFTA Court, which is in Luxembourg. And when it comes to the enforcement, that is ESA, that you will also hear more about in detail later. So the challenge, when the parties sat down to find this agreement, well, it was to reconcile two quite different models of cooperation. On the EFTA side, it is supranational cooperation, it is transfer of competence from the member states to the EU bodies, and it's also transfer of sovereignty. On our side, we are in intergovernmental cooperation. There is no transfer of such competence, and we also don't have common policies with the EU. Then you might think, oh, but you know, aren't we collaborating on, for instance, climate policies and so on? Yes, we do, but that is outside, or part of that is outside the agreement. On the EU side, the institutions have defined roles in the decision-making process, meaning the legislative process, being the Commission, that is often mapping an area and proposes legislation, the European Parliament and the Council, the Parliament being the elected members from member states, and the Council that consists of the EU member states representatives. On our side, it is decisions taken by consensus between the governments of the EFTA states. This means that we are not ready to take any legal act into the agreement before the three countries have agreed that this is a relevant act for the agreement, and secondly, that they're also ready to do so. And after that, we also, of course, have to have the EU side a part of that, because there are two parties to this agreement. An important side, and I would say a lot of the backbone of what we in the Secretariat work with every day, is the important concerns that I am mentioning in the end here. On the EU side, it is to preserve the decision-making autonomy of the EU. When we get a legal act for assessment in the Secretariat and then by the member states, 27 members of the EU, countries have already agreed to this text. And as much as we are entering into that market, it's of course vital that we remain with the same rules. I often use the football comparison, which makes it a bit odd for anyone to have one team on one side have different rules than the other. It makes it more difficult and very often unfair. Another important concern on the EFTA side is to preserving the sovereignty, because the three states, there were reasons. One of the reasons why they did not enter into the EU as members was because they wanted their parliaments to continue to have a role. To reach those objectives and to facilitate for the agreement, there was set up an institutional model, the EEA institutional model. It is also very often referred to the two-pillar structure. And here you see how it is structured. On the left side is the EFTA pillar, and on the right side is the EU pillar. So all of these bodies are very vital for making the agreement work. And in the middle you see some blue boxes. That's where these bodies meet. The highest governing and political body of the EEA Corporation is the EEA Council. That's where the ministers of foreign affairs meet twice a year, and in the fall session they actually meet in this room. And yeah, maybe just some water. Yeah, no water. Yeah, so they meet twice a year. Then they look at how the agreement work, and they also look at how what political directions it should continue to take. And then we have the Standing Committee, which is another important body. And sorry, I forgot to mention, of course, then they meet the Council Presidency, which now is Denmark, and representatives from the Secretariat-General of the Commission. Then they also have the next line here is the Standing Committee, which is composes of the EU ambassadors from our three countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And on the other side, representatives from the European Commission, then again by the Secretariat-General. They meet in the Joint Committee, and the Joint Committee is where you actually adopt EU legal act. That's where EU law becomes EEA law, also, and then it is an international agreement that we have to follow up. They meet 8 times a year, normally on Fridays, and the Standing Committee meets normally the day before on Thursdays. And then you see the Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court, and on the other hand side, the European Commission and the Court of Justice of the European Union. They have no boxes in between, and that is because they don't have joint bodies where they discuss and decide things. They make their decisions separately, and you will also hear a bit more about that from ESA a bit later, and the court a bit later today. I mentioned a bit again the parliamentary committees, and that you will also hear more about, so I will not go further on, but this is anyway the setup that is working every day for the agreement. So then the setup, and what is the framework? Well, the substantial scope of the agreement. The core of the agreement are the 4 freedoms. The free movement of goods, services, capitals, and persons. And in addition to that, when you look at it and how the internal market works, it is of course necessary to support that with other policies and common rules. When it comes to the common rules, it is state aid, competition, and public procurement. These are areas that are supposed to support both public and private companies and entities to make sure that their behavior doesn't hamper the four freedoms. In addition, it became clear that several areas in our societies also needed to have common rules and cooperation. Some of them are environment, social policy, consumer protection, statistics, company law, but also labor rights for workers, etc. EU programs is a huge and very important part of our cooperation with the EU. These days, we are assessing the new program proposals and the new financial framework for that. The EU is changing this a lot, and it's actually going to be very interesting for us to see how that fits into the agreement and what changes or to what extent our member state can participate. It is very important because it gives us access to the programs, and it also gives us access to a lot of research, innovation, cooperation across Europe for our member states. And finally, EEA and Norway grants. I know that the head of FMO, Ragna, is coming later on. That is also a part of the cooperation. FMO, Financial Mechanism Office, they are also in this house, and we will hear more about how they work a bit later on. It's also worth mentioning, especially these days maybe, the policy areas that are not covered by the EEA cooperation through the agreement. The agreement doesn't cover economic and monetary union, trade policy provisions, EU's aid policy, the customs union, common agriculture and fishery policy, justice and home affairs, and common foreign and security policy. And for those of you who pay attention to the global world and the global situation, you would think, but a lot of things are happening in these fields these days, especially some of them. I will come a bit back to that later, but yes, of course. And not only is it happening outside the framework of EEA, but it's also affecting the internal market. So a bit to the actual process, how we work with the agreement every day and the role of the Secretariat in this. Well, there are two main strands of the EEA work. It is decision shaping, participation to the development of EU legislation before EU adopts. Many of you have probably heard politicians say that we have to be proactive in our EEA work, we have to be early, we have to try and influence and assist in developing EU legislation. This is done in the early, before EU adopts. That's before the 27 countries have already have decided on new legislation, and this is of course the time where we have best reasons and chances to succeed in trying to help shaping the EU or European legislation that is also in our common interest. The other strand is decision making. Incorporation of an adopted EU and EEA relevant legislative act into the EEA agreement. Because this is what the EU agreement is all about, to take that EU legislation and transfer it into the framework of the EEA agreement, which is a bit smaller, as you saw earlier, those that are covering policies that are less than the framework of EU cooperation. So just this can be a bit confusing maybe, but I just wanted to very briefly again, this is the EU side and this is the EFTA side. I will not go too much into that, but both the Secretariat and our 3 EEA EFTA member states are part of the process along the way. At the proposal stage, when legal acts are being worked on in the Commission and in expert groups of the Commission, our member states have the right to attend, have the right to speak, but not the right to vote on any possible voting at that level. This is something that we have through the EEA agreement. We are supposed to be consulted as member states. This is of course useful, mutually useful, because it is, as this eventually becomes national law, it is useful also for the member states, both in the EU side and it's in our common interest again that we get to participate and not to mention understand the process and what the Commission or the EU side actually wants to regulate and how. We go through the whole process, and eventually, when the Council or when the EU side is adopting a new regulation, that's when the formal work starts on the EFTA side, namely by our EEA Registrar on the 5th floor. He is every morning going through all the list of newly published acts on the EU side and see if there is anything that we should start working on the EFTA side, whether that is, we think it should be assessed if it should be incorporated into the agreement. Along the way, we also have some means of decision shaping, but that we will also have even further depth into that. So the work on these legal acts then, how does it work? I showed you this one earlier. And this is a framework which is quite known, but of course the framework of how to make EU law, EEA law, that it can be a very lengthy process. I think the oldest act we have is still from early 2000. So of course a lot of work is happening before the ambassadors agree to say yes to take something into the agreement. And that work happens behind here. There is another structure there that I will show you and explain a bit about, because the standing committee consisting of the EEA ambassadors, they have another framework to support them. First of all, 5 subcommittees. 4 of them are handled in my unit. And these, all of these names here, that is names of EFTA working groups who are assessing different EEA legal acts. Subcommittees, that is representatives from the foreign ministries in Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. Also the subcommittee 5, they are not meeting as frequently, but they are taking care of the legal and institutional matters. It's also important that all of these groups, if we have some horizontal issues, that we treat them the same way to keep predictability and to make sure that we have a legal certainty for in the whole of the EEA. I have made some colorful circles here just to I illustrate a bit how also the work of the agreement changes. First of all, the yellow ones. Postal services was extremely hot quite some years ago, I have to say, not only because we sent more letters, but because there was a directive that was a bit controversial, and the government in Norway decided that they did not want to incorporate it because they didn't believe in the new legislation, although the area in itself is within the framework of the EEA agreement. There was a change of government, and the 3 EEA EFTA states agreed that yes, we are ready to take this into the agreement after all. So after that, we have both the stopped sending letters, and the legislation is not so controversial anymore. Public health was one of the areas in my division that was something, because we normally have experts coming from capitals. So you could be an expert on health, or you can be an expert on labor law or whatever. But the health area was like, okay, but you just take that working group as well. It doesn't matter if you know something else. Then something happened, and I guess you all know, COVID. I think the girl who used to be in charge of that, I think she worked absolutely most and mainly with that 24/7 for a long, long time. And that is also, I think, the working group that has the world record in incorporation of EEA law. That was 3 days. I said sometimes we have both years and decades to get something in, but that was the COVID certificates. To me, that says a lot about the foundation that the EEA agreement is all about, because it was trust between the parties within the agreement. We could make special processes for swift incorporation in an area that we hadn't really dealt with so much before. But again, unfortunately, it's not so busy there yet. Having said that, there are also new initiatives that before maybe was outside the area of the agreement that is now been taken care of, and important to develop European solutions for. 2 areas that are high on the agenda an important, and has been so for a long time. Energy matters. Many of you know that not only did we have energy crisis, but we've also, again speaking for Norway, had a government that was split in two because of energy issues. And energy is, of course, vital to all societies in all over Europe and within the EEA. So it's important that we have good systems and a well-functioning energy market as well. The other area which is quite changing and quite important for our societies is the digital sector. We decided to give it a very short and understandable name, so Electronic Communication, Audiovisual Services and Information Society. We might change that at some point, Trond, don't you think? But anyway, that's the long word, but that consists of all the digital decade, the digital framework of the EU, and of course top important challenges as well, though, because our three countries have to find new solutions. It doesn't necessarily fit into the EEA agreement. There is a will politically and also practically to incorporate these matters, but it takes time because not only do we have to agree in three countries, but the EU side also have to be comfortable with the way that we find common solutions for surveillance, for how to follow up this legislation. And finally, I just put 3 blue circles as well. The budgetary matters and research and development is just 2 out of several working groups that will deal with the new program period. I mentioned it earlier that this is a very important part of our cooperation. And enterprise policy is the working group with us that is the kind of hub for like overarching internal market initiatives. Recently, we have seen the EU changing a bit their way of regulating. Before, in the first 30 years, we were basically regulating the machinery. We had regulations that are connected to the how to say the everyday work of a market. And because of the global situation, geopolitical situation in the world as well, Europe and the EU institutions and member states have, of course, seen that they need to work a bit differently, not only to make the work function internally, but also protect their biggest assets to threats from outside. Part of this is inside in the core of the agreement, and part of it is outside. And that's why we also then have to find solutions and work very closely, I have to say, with the EU side to see how we can fit and continue the cooperation within this framework. Yes, decision making, that is, let me just see, that is, hang on, I just have to see what I was supposed to say here. I'm not going to say so much, so that's probably why I don't remember. The numbers and the key sectors is what we're going to jump into. Just wanted to say one thing about decision making, because the second strand, so the decision-making process and how EU becomes EEA law, I've mentioned a bit of it, but our head of legal, Karoline, will dive into that a bit later. So I'm just telling you, it is a very, I mean, this is what we do in the Secretariat every single day, and she will make it less complicated and more understandable for all of you. And she's very good at that. So just look forward. No pressure, Karoline. But before we go into that, and that's what I wanted to say now, I just also wanted to, because yes, we're talking about all these legal acts that we incorporate and so on, but what are we talking about in facts and figures? Well, when we signed the agreement in '92, there were 1,875 acts incorporated at the signing. Since then, we have incorporated 15,000-ish, I think it is 15,009 actually today, since the signing. That is quite a substantial number. 8,803, to be accurate or something, is in force today. These numbers, of course, at least the 2 last ones, keep growing. Food and veterinary is by far the biggest area. Last year, they incorporated 202 acts in this area. That's 38% of all the acts incorporated in 2024. Normally they are closer to 50% as well. And that is, of course, all these, well, at least for me, very difficult both to pronounce and understand the content of words of what is containing in our food, in the food chain and so on. I see that some people from the Norwegian food authorities nodding here, so at least we have experts who knows what this is all about. Other high volume sectors is goods, technical barriers to trade. That was the second on the list with almost 30%, 164 acts incorporated last year. And financial services is another one, 15%. And there are other big sectors, transport, environment, and energy that maybe last year were not so big, but there is a lot of secondary acts building up, because whenever we block a so-called mother act, the head act, all the other acts needs to wait for that. In addition, and we see also up and coming areas, I mentioned a bit this new way of legislating in the internal market, where you actually maybe use trade mechanisms to regulate elements related to the internal market. We, as a very, again, challenging word to understand the content of, but there are acts with so-called distinct horizontal challenges, and the challenges is mainly that the legal acts are outside the sort of general scope of the EEA agreement, but they do affect the internal market. And when they affect the internal market, they also affect EEA. And as our 3 member states are parts of the EEA, it is important to find solutions for that, because nor do we want to be a loophole in the internal market. And we also, of course, don't want our businesses to suffer from being half inside, half outside. So this is, again, important. Omnibus. The EU, again, as a package and how to be more competitive, is looking into a simplification agenda, challenging for us to have some acts that are long outstanding. It takes a bit of time before we get them into the agreement, which is natural and inherent. So again, needed to be close, very, very close cooperation on the EU side. You will meet Matúš a bit later. I think sometimes he's more in the EFTA House than anywhere else in Brussels. But this is necessary and a part of the everyday cooperation. And then, of course, I also said the new program period, which is something that I think this week or the last week already has been 5 or 6 meetings between our 3 member states with speakers from member states and so on to help us understand the proposals that are now on the table and how it will influence our ways of participating and what it will mean financially and so on. I'm coming to the end here, and I just also want to say a bit the volumes in total. I said a bit about last year. We hear very often about the backlog, and that means that we have a good chunk of acts that are waiting incorporation. That is that orange line there. You see that, in fact, it is quite stable. But you also may see, I mean, now we only go back to 2017, but if we go even further back, the EU was publishing a lot more acts for us to assess. It used to be maybe as low as 300-400 in 2013-14. That's the green areas here. Last year we identified 700 the EU adopted 780 legal acts. And we incorporated, that's the blue line, 557 of them. And 130, though, that's the acts that are excluded, that is deemed to be outside the scope of the EEA agreement. So you see that there is quite a lot of acts. We have also more complex acts. So it means also that it takes longer to find solutions. So if you take that into perspective, you know, at least we are not working slower, which is very good. But that doesn't mean, I mean, whether we work slower or not, the backlog of 500 is, of course, a challenge, because it means that we are not at the same level of legislation in total within the internal market. So to sum up, the EEA agreement in the Europe of today. We always say and we always hear that it has remained robust and resilient. The EU adopts more and more complex legislation, and the nature of the agreement that I just mentioned gives us this inherent delay of incorporation. The ongoing new initiatives are followed by new legislation, and often a lot of new legislation, that affects the internal market and thereby the EEA as a whole. Timely incorporation is of essence, and strategic choices must be made, because if we have a legal act that is so-called outside the scope of the agreement, our politicians may say, well, we don't think this is relevant, so we shouldn't look at that. That's why we also have made a kind of, we have made a new setup of these kind of legislation and the way we work both with the EU side and internally in EFTA with our member states, that we have to look at strategic decisions first. What's the interest of our nationals to do so? And then later on we can figure out whether we should work within the framework of the agreement or through other agreements that we also have quite a few of with the EU. The challenges in managing the EEA agreement is that we have different scope between the EU and the EEA law. We have increased regulatory powers to EU agencies. They were not invented when the EU EEA agreement was in force in '94. And the geopolitical situation reflects the EU developments, as it always has with the EU, but now it becomes more complex and we need to find new solutions. This is internal market legislation with a touch of trade policy, industry policy, security issues, not to mention. That is quite obvious, even just what has happened the last 24 hours, I suppose, with drones, especially in Northern Europe. So Brussels, in the third quarter of 2025, the new game continues. We have a fairly new commission up and running. The new program period is in the making. It will be high on all our countries' agenda in the future, or from now on, at least for the next couple of years, till we have incorporated what needs to be incorporated. New legislation keeps coming, and the geopolitical challenges continues. So cooperation, as you have heard me said, I think quite a few times already, is a key. And that is what we need to do, not only to make the EEA agreement work, but also to make Europe and the EEA area such a safe place, competitive place, where both people and businesses can continue to grow to the benefit of our welfare. EEA knowledge and close cooperation is essential to ensure a well-functioning agreement across the EEA. So thank you for participating, because the fact that you are here today makes us all better in this common work. Thank you.
I do everything, you know. Turn on the mics, get water. If anyone needs their shoes to be polished in the break, I can take care of that. Thank you so much, Marit. So this is what we call the master class. I know it's overwhelming. I know it's a lot, but do not worry. We are going to look in more detail into these three strands that Marit talked about. We're going to think about and talk about the decision shaping. How can the EEA EFTA states influence where EU policy is heading? We're also going to hear from the EU. You know, this is not a one-sided conversation. Of course, the key word here is collaboration. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the decision making, how EU law becomes EEA law. And I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage Karoline Lumholdt Mathisen. She's the head of legal here at the Secretariat.
Thank you, Ásdís. Good morning. Oh, wow, it's really fantastic to see so many people in the room. I understand we have more people next door, and of course, lots of people watching online as well. Feel the pressure, all your eyes on me. I'll try to keep my best to keep your attention for 10 to 15 minutes and hopefully give at least some of you some new knowledge about the EEA agreement. The clicker, I need some here. Yeah, there we go. So, topic for my intervention this morning is how EU law becomes EEA law. And Marit covered some of the magical aspects of the agreement. I will bring you back to realities and explain some of the more practical aspects of how the EEA agreement works. However, my presentation is just an introduction. I am just a warm-up act, in fact, because the topics I'm covering this morning will be explained in much more detail by two of my excellent colleagues in a breakout session this afternoon. So for those of you who are present here in the EFTA House, be sure to catch one of the two breakout sessions that will happen here in this room about this topic later today. So, for my introduction this morning, I will cover roughly these three elements. First, I will speak about homogeneity. This is a word that you have already heard this morning and that you will most certainly hear many times today. It is an essential feature of the EEA agreement and very important to understand properly. Second, I will take you through the steps of the incorporation process, which is what we call the process of making EU law into EEA law. And lastly, I will say a few words about the resources that we have available to help you navigate the complexities and information relevant to the EEA agreement. So, let me dive into the first topic, homogeneity. So, this is to start with the context. Why are we talking about this? Why does EU law become EEA law? And this is because of the principle of homogeneity, which is, as Marit also mentioned, the main principle of the EEA, namely that the European Economic Area, meaning the EU member states and the three EEA EFTA states, is an area based on the same rules. Now, we can say that there are three different dimensions to homogeneity, or three different angles, if you like. First, we have the judicial dimension, that the rules should be uniformly interpreted and applied. Second, we have the surveillance dimension, that the rules should be uniformly enforced. I will not talk more about these two aspects of homogeneity because, as mentioned, we have colleagues from the EFTA Court and the EFTA Surveillance Authority who will say more about this later this morning. But the third dimension is the dynamic dimension, which is based on Article 102 of the EEA Agreement. And this dynamic element is quite a unique feature of the EEA Agreement. It means that the agreement is constantly updated to keep up to date with developments. EU law is constantly being made into EEA law, so to speak, and this is because the internal market, as Marit also talked about this morning, is continuously evolving. So this is the why we're making EU law into EEA law. Now I'll say a few words about the what. So what kind of EU law becomes EEA law? Well, it's only EEA relevant EU legislation. And what is EEA relevance? Well, it's EU law that falls under the scope of the EEA agreement. Marit also mentioned a little bit about the scope. So it is essentially the internal market, often described as the four freedoms. So the free movement of goods, services, capital, and persons, also the competition and state aid rules, and then what we often refer to as the flanking and horizontal policies. For example, the cooperation in the fields of environment, social policy, the programs, and other elements. But there are certain EU policies that do not fall within the scope of the EEA agreement. Typical example is the common agricultural and fisheries policies. These areas are not EEA relevant, meaning legislation in those areas are not made part of the EEA agreement. To sum up, only legislation, EU legislation, in the fields that are covered by the EEA agreement can become EEA law. So, I mentioned the why and the what, and here is sort of how it's done. This is, in one slide, the incorporation process. It starts actually before the legislation is even finalized. This is the time for possible decision shaping. I will skip over this part because my colleague Trond will speak after me and he will talk about this topic in more detail. So I will instead start at the point where the legislation is adopted in the EU. And here, just to clarify, the legislation that we're talking about can be various forms of EU legal acts, meaning directives, regulations, decisions, and more. Also, they can be adopted at all levels in the EU, so the EU Parliament and Council legislation, but also Commission delegated and implementing acts, and so on. So the adoption in the EU, at whichever level it occurs, is sort of the kick-off point to the incorporation process. The next step of the process is where an assessment of the legal acts takes place. Both we at the EFTA Secretariat and the 3 EEA EFTA states carry out an assessment of the EU acts. One of the elements in this assessment is indeed whether the act is EEA relevant, as we just talked about. But this assessment also includes looking into whether there are any challenges, as we often call it, for making the act fit into the framework of the EEA Agreement. If there are, this could require that we make adaptations to the Act so that it can be made part of the EEA Agreement. Now, this aspect is something that the workshop this afternoon that I mentioned earlier will really dive deeper into, so I will not go into further detail at this point. I will move on to the third part of the process, the drafting stage. So we at the EFTA Secretariat are responsible for making a draft decision for the EEA Joint Committee to incorporate or make the part of the EEA Agreement. This draft decision is approved by our 3 member states and then submitted to the EU side. And our counterpart in this side, in this respect, is the Secretariat-General of the Commission, and our regular colleague Matúš will speak also later this morning and talk a little bit more about what happens on their side. In brief terms, of course, the Commission is a huge organization. They need to consult all relevant divisions. But sometimes there is a little bit of back and forth in this part of the process to agree on, for example, texts of the wording of the adaptations, for example. But then finally, we have a final text that we agree upon, and then we can move on to the fourth and the final step, the actual adoption in the EEA Joint Committee. Now, I think it was mentioned earlier, the EEA Joint Committee typically meets about 8 times a year. Before each meeting, the Secretariat, again, draws up a list of the draft decisions and legal acts that have reached a stage where they are agreed and are ready for incorporation into the EEA Agreement. This we often refer to as the long list, for those of you who are in the know. As you saw on Marit's slides, we incorporate somewhere upwards of 600 legal acts per year, around 300 to 400 decisions of the EEA Joint Committee, and this number has been steadily increasing in recent years. So, once these decisions have been adopted, what is left is for the Joint Committee decisions to enter into force. Usually, decisions enter into force the day after they're adopted. However, the EEA Agreement also caters for certain constitutional requirements of the EEA EFTA states. This is a little bit technical, so bear with me. But if the incorporation of the Act into the EEA Agreement calls for legislative changes in one or more of the EEA EFTA states, meaning that the national parliaments need to be involved, the EEA state may notify this to the Joint Committee, and then the decision will only enter into force once the constitutional requirements have been fulfilled. So, we have covered why we're doing this, is for the reason of homogeneity. We covered what we're doing. We're incorporating EEA-relevant EU law into the agreement. Said a few words about the procedure, how it is done in a nutshell. And I will say a few words about who handles the formal decision-making. It's been already mentioned many times today, the EEA Joint Committee. This is the main body that takes decisions in the EEA. This committee consists of the ambassadors of the EEA EFTA states and representatives of the Secretariat-General of the Commission, both of whom are present here today. Now, the institutional framework of the agreement could be a topic of a whole presentation in its own right, so I will just give a brief overview. And you saw the slides on Marit, Marit gave as well, more visually. But before each meeting of the EEA Joint Committee, the EEA EFTA Standing Committee meets to harmonize the views of the EEA EFTA states, as they speak with what we say one voice in the Joint Committee. And under the Standing Committee, there are 5 subcommittees, as earlier mentioned, and under these subcommittees, there are numerous working groups and expert groups. And these bodies bring together the experts of the EEA EFTA states at different levels to discuss the legal acts and, that are under assessment for the incorporation into the agreement. I'm going through it faster. We're going back on time. Before I conclude, I wanted to briefly mention where to find EEA legal acts. The acts that have gone through the process that I've explained this morning have then become EEA legal acts. We have some resources on our website, efta.int, to help you find relevant information about these EEA legal acts. And the slides will be made available after the seminar today, so you can also find the links that are on there easily. I will start by mentioning EEA Lex, and I've included a screenshot from EEA Lex. This is a searchable database that we have available on the website. In EEA Lex, you can search for specific legal acts, and you will see where in the process they are. You get this timeline overview. So you can see where it's in process. Is it being under assessment? Is it adopted? Is it not yet in force? Has it sort of gone out of force again? And you will also find links to many relevant documents, such as the EEA Joint Committee decision and information about the entry into force date. The documents are available in all the EFTA languages, and we also provide links to the documents in the EU languages. We also have 2 interactive web tools that I encourage you to explore. One is called How EU Law Becomes EEA Law, going into the details of the processes that I have talked about very briefly this morning, including a lot of information about how these processes are handled in our 3 member states and on the EU side as well. And then we have a web tool called How to Read EEA Law, which explains to you how the different sources of law needs to come together in order to find the actual rule that is applicable. So that brings me to the end of this introduction to how EU law becomes EEA law. Thank you very much for your attention, and I repeat, you can get more information if you're interested in the workshops this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Karoline. There was a comment left for the breakout session last year, the one that Karoline is referring to, which was, this is a direct quote, "I didn't know legal processes could be so fun." Now, you know, that is just a quote from a participant, so this breakout session will be held here in the afternoon, and we will talk more about the breakout sessions later. Karoline explained the processes and how we have to adapt the legal acts so that they fit our markets. But obviously, it's a bit of a challenge if the EU, representing 450 million, have agreed to an act and we come at that stage and say, actually, this doesn't work for us. You know, we have to have a homogeneous market. And so it is in everyone's interest that we are having conversations before that decision-making process begins. And to talk about that, we have with us here our colleague Trond Helge Bårdsen. He is going to talk about the decision shaping that happens here at the Secretariat. Trond, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ásdís, and good morning, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to basically take a step back a little bit again and talk about what we are doing at that stage before the co-legislators in the EU, the Council and the Parliament, together with the Commission, of course, make up their mind and the legal acts are finally agreed upon and published from the EU side. And that is what we call decision shaping. I am working in Marit's division at the EFTA Secretariat, so I deal with a lot of these digital files, and that's, of course, as we heard now, our daily bread. That's what we are doing all the time, working to incorporate these acts. But I'm also responsible for coordinating what we call the EEA Commons, which are the common position papers that we submit to the EU side. So, as I'm sure very many of you are aware of, there's nothing in the EEA agreement that gives us kind of formal decision-making powers. So we are not present in Council, of course. We don't have our MEPs in Parliament. But still in the EEA agreement, we have this article saying that the Commission shall take the views of the EEA EFTA states into consideration when preparing new legislation in the same way as they take into consideration the views of the EU member states. And that's, of course, why we have a lot of focus on this aspect of decision shaping. I'd also just want to mention that, yes, the EEA agreement, of course, makes us the closest partner to the EU and as closely integrated into the internal market that you can possibly be. But also it's important that the EEA states bring quite a lot of assets also to the table. It's a win-win situation we are in through the EEA agreement. But we are also small, open market economies. We are characterized by a lot of trust between citizens and the government. Technologically, we are quite advanced, all the three states. And if you look in today's world, for instance, on some important parameters, like, for instance, press freedom, participation of women, etc., we are quite advanced, which also makes us kind of an interesting partner when it comes to developing new EU legislation. So that's an important kind of backdrop, I think, as well, when we work exactly in this phase with shaping the future EEA legislation. And it is the case that we actually have quite a lot of means available to us, or different instruments, different arenas where we meet with the EU side. And our ambition is that we want to contribute as actively as possible towards how the decisions turn out, all the way up until they are formally decided on the EU side. And we do so, of course, which has already been mentioned by Marit, through the rights that the EEA agreement gives us, for instance, to participate in EU or Commission expert groups and comitology committees. It's a very important arena. We don't have voting rights there, but we are present and we can express our views. And we see a tendency, also with regard to EU legislation, I think we can see that often also we have legislation that kind of regulates at a little bit of a principle level, you might say, where a lot of kind of the technical requirements come through secondary legislation, comes through implementing acts and delegated acts, and that of course takes place in those. The discussions on that take place in those committees and also the expert groups where we are present. So it's an important arena where we can get our views across. We have seconded national experts that are sent from ministries and authorities in our member states and that work in the Commission. They are, of course, working for the Commission. That's very important. And they are loyal to the Commission. But of course, they are also what we might call like EFTA ambassadors for our agreement, and also, of course, are important for us to kind of give us heads up about important initiatives that are coming from the EU side, so we can monitor as well what's coming. Then we are present in the program committees. We also have a long precedent for being present in shadow program committees before the programs are formally adopted on the EU side, and that's also an important arena to get our views across when it comes to what the funds should actually be used for under the different programs. Then we are present in the EU agencies, in the management boards. Often the Commission uses perhaps the agencies as well as kind of sounding boards when planning new initiatives. And then, of course, we have EFTA Commons, which I'm going to talk a bit more about now. But very important to emphasize as well is this working group structure that we saw on the slide earlier. I mean, we, through the working groups, with our experts from the capitals, are meeting the Commission regularly, very often, of course. Usually when you look at all the different policy areas, every week we have meetings with the Commission and a lot of contact, of course. So that's also kind of on the day-to-day basis really important, that dialogue we have through our working groups. The EEA Commons, they are the formal position papers that are agreed by all the EEA states and that we aim to submit often and ideally, of course, as early as possible. So when the Commission starts to have what they call have your say or publish a roadmap on a new initiative, we want to be as early as possible when there's a new strategy brewing on the EU side. But we do it also, of course, after the Commission has published a proposal, when it goes into negotiations, or the Parliament or Council needs to make up their mind, and then when we move into what we call the trilogue negotiations. So all the way at those different steps, we try to be present, and we submit these comments then quite widely to the EU side, to the Secretariat-General, which is our former counterpart on the EU side, but also, of course, to relevant committees in the Parliament, rapporteurs, shadow rapporteurs, and of course also always the current and the future presidency of the Council. Just some examples recently of comments we've had now just before the summer and during the summer as well on the simplification agenda, of course, very important to us. As was mentioned earlier, it influences a lot of the legislation that is now in process as well in the EEA process. The Buy European, the future revision of the Public Procurement Directive that is due in 2026, but that's also already now kind of important elements in a lot of proposals, like the Critical Medicines Act, of course the EU programs. We have AI and Cloud Act coming up. These elements can be important there, and of course it's important to get our key messages across as early as possible. And these comments are, of course, as targeted as possible. I mean, we are trying to explain as clearly as possible what should be changed in the proposals and what are important interests and concerns for the EEA EFTA states. But they are also a tool for maintaining this dialogue with the EU side. We experience often very concretely that when we get to that stage that we are discussing potential adaptations with the EU side, it is very useful if you have already had an EEA EFTA comment, because that also shows a bit to the EU side that yes, we are an interesting partner here. We do have views on these legislations, and very concretely, it's often very much easier for people on our side to pick up the phone with the EU side. Now we need to start this legislation, and then the answer on the other side is, okay, we saw that you had this EEA EFTA comment like a year earlier or further back in time. And I think also it's important, as a little bit what I said in the beginning as well, we are an intergovernmental organization. We are working on public policy. We are not perhaps a typical lobby organization that there are a lot of in Brussels, of course. So that's also, I think, important in the sense that we also feel that the EU side listens when we do have views to express on new proposals and strategies. It's complicated to try and adapt to what is happening on the EU side, because it's very dynamic, of course. And once we move into this stage that the Parliament and the Council are working on their positions, of course we have to spend a lot of time also trying to monitor and see how things then develop in order to be relevant. Because we want to follow this process, and of course sometimes we would have to adapt perhaps our positions and also look out for if there is movement in Council or Parliament, someone is going in our direction or not going in the direction that we would like to see. Just very lastly at the end, of course, this is also key. We submit these comments, but then we need to follow up on them. And we have an established practice and precedent whereby the Commission, always when we submit the EFTA comments, comes back to us, to the relevant working group that deals with that policy area, and then interacts with our experts, explaining, of course, where the proposal now is in the different stages, and how, if possible, our comments could be taken into view. That's of course the most kind of concrete follow-up, but there's also a lot of bilateral meetings going on, arranged by the capitals in our member states through the EFTA missions, etc. And of course, the feedback we get through those channels as well is very important to kind of see whether we need to perhaps follow up with further comments. I want to finish just by saying on the programs, that's of course going to be a very important area now going forward, the new EU program proposals, and that's perhaps the area where we are working most actively at the moment, looking at how we can get our views across, and it was mentioned also to interact with the other member states, how they are viewing and what kind of priorities they might have in relation to the new EU programs. Last pitch for the workshop, of course, we also have afterwards to dig more into this aspect, decision shaping. And then we'll also have other colleagues joining us and looking a bit broader on how we can work also with the capitals and then the advisory bodies, etc., to try and shape EEA legislation. Thank you.
Yes, Trond is giving one of the breakout sessions with our colleague Ingerid, who you will hear from later today. So, I know it's been a lot. One question, are you cold in the back? Yes, okay, so the women are cold because they're wearing short sleeves, and the men are warm because they're wearing suits. But on average, we're fine. And it's a bit like Goldilocks in here, you know, some are too hot, some are too cold. Okay, well, I think then we will just have to have a coffee to warm up very soon. But first, we have now given you the overview of the technical part, really, of this discussion here today about how these things work from the Secretariat's perspective. But I'm very pleased that our next speaker comes from, I don't want to say the other side, because we are basically, we want to be on the same side, but our counterpart, Matúš Minárik. He is the EEA Policy Coordinator at the Secretariat-General at the European Commission. He spends his days here, and in the evenings he is also very culturally involved, because he just saw Sigurrós play at the Beaux-Arts, so you can stop him during the coffee break and discuss that. But let's stay with business. Matúš, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was thinking about that other side also. Well, EEA, we formed together. It's 30 member states, so we're the two sides inside there. So thank you very much for the invitation, and a couple of words from me on how we work with EEA on the EU side and in the Commission. So I'll start with that. I'll talk a bit about how we view the homogeneity and level playing field issue. I'll mention some of the challenges that you've already heard from previous speakers also about. And then I briefly mentioned the EEA and Norway grants and that aspect of our cooperation. There will be also a more detailed presentation later. And finally, a couple of words about beyond EEA. So first, let me start with what also Trond mentioned, that you are indeed the closest partners, and we keep saying that in EEA councils at the highest political level, and also not at that high political level, and we mean it. It's not only the EEA, it's also like-mindedness and alignment on many international issues, on climate change, let's say, on Russia and Ukraine, alignment on sanctions, rule of law, so we appreciate this closeness. Of course, the EEA agreement forms the bedrock of our relations, but it's not only the EEA agreement. It's also Schengen, it's also other agreements. I think there's dozens and dozens of agreements that link us together. Of course, the EEA agreement, we consider it both a robust agreement because it covers most of what the EU is, although not everything, and also a flexible agreement because it allows for its dynamic growth and alignment. I think it was Marit's slide that showed the number of acts altogether incorporated, the number of acts that are currently in place, and also the pace of acts that we're incorporating every year. So that represents the flexibility of the agreement that has actually not been amended in 30 years, but has grown over those 30 years. And that's how it is a living animal that we have to manage together. So on the Commission side, as you know, in the EU system, Commission is the guardian of the treaties. That's our role inside of the EU system. So when it comes to work on the EEA agreement, we also see ourselves as the guardian of EEA agreement. This, of course, doesn't take away the role of ESA. I see Melpo sitting here. She'll be talking about the enforcement, and of course, ESA has the enforcement role vis-à-vis the EEA EFTA states. We're also guardian of the interests of the EU member states vis-à-vis the EEA EFTA states, the same way as the EFTA states, of course, look at the interests of the EFTA states. On the EU side, Commission took over the lead on the EEA agreement in 2022. Before, this role was taken up by the European External Action Service. The idea behind was that because this relationship is focused around the internal market, it's an economic integration relationship, it makes more sense to put this role in the Commission, while of course EAS continues to be in charge of bilateral relations, diplomacy, and has a role, of course, that continues vis-à-vis the 3 EEA EFTA states. But on EEA, we're in the lead. Politically, we're under Commissioner Šefčovič from the beginning of this change. He was vice president before. Now he's commissioner. He's also commissioner for trade, which of course makes sense from our point of view that these are now under the same umbrella at the political level. We're a small team in Secretariat-General, together with colleagues that work on other West European partners. UK, Switzerland, Andorra, San Marino, and Monaco, very different type of countries, very different type of relations we have with them, and very different stage of relations. We have EEA agreement that has been in place for 30 years. We have proposals made to upgrade the relations with Switzerland through a new set of agreements. We have association agreement proposal with Andorra and San Marino. But all of these have common together that they give access to internal market of the EU based on contractual relation. I said we're a small team, but at the same time, we work together with all the DGs. So DGs on the European Commission side, these are like line ministries in charge of policies in certain sectors. So in each one, we have a EEA coordinator. And then, of course, when it comes to work on direct files or incorporation of certain acts, we might work directly with experts that have actually prepared those acts on our side and, of course, knows the nitty-gritty. So the core team is very small, but actually there's many people behind that are involved and could be very involved. Karoline mentioned how we run inter-service consultations on every single draft joint committee decision proposal that we get from you. These could be very simple proposals where basically an EU act is inserted into the EEA agreement and only horizontal adaptations apply. You will surely learn about those in the seminar, in the breakout session. But even in the cases of those, you could have sometimes questions that come up from the line DGs where colleagues suggest, yes, it's a simple act to insert into the EEA agreement, but actually it makes sense to insert it together with some other acts. So even in those cases, sometimes we liaise back on issues that at first glance look very trivial, and we have a discussion on how it makes most sense to do this so it works best for both of us. And then we have, of course, adaptations that make the acts work in the two-pillar system. And those we frequently discuss. We can discuss them also at length. Of course, the adaptations are not the room for maneuver. This is something that has appeared in media across the EFTA states. So these are there to make those acts work across the EEA and to ensure homogeneity and level playing field. So that's the main thing from our side. Also, Just to echo what also Marit has said on what is covered by the EEA agreement, it's the 4 freedoms, internal market, but many areas are not covered. You've mentioned them all: trade and customs, agriculture, fisheries, taxation, justice and home affairs. So these are areas outside. Some of them are covered by specific other agreements, like Schengen. And then also just to mention that when it comes to enforcement, of course, Commission and ESA are independent bodies, but we cooperate together. We organize annual surveillance policy dialogues, probably Melpo will mention that afterwards, where we look at methodologies, because we both want to ensure a uniformity and homogeneous application of the EEA law across the whole EEA. And then, of course, there's also actual casework where case officers in ESA and in the Commission working on specific cases can work together, because there's obligation of loyal cooperation on both institutions. So that to mention on the enforcement aspect. When it comes to homogeneity and level playing field, Marit mentioned the magic. So for us, the magic is the Article 102 of the EEA agreement, and that's the article that talks about the dynamic alignment and the obligation to take on the acts that are EEA relevant into the EEA agreement. So, of course, that doesn't happen by magic, but there's a lot of work behind. Karoline mentioned part of it, I mentioned part of it, but it's an obligation. We work together on this. When you see the EU acts appearing, you might have noticed that they are all marked, well, all. Those that are EEA relevant are actually marked EEA relevant. Some people think that these actually are acts that already apply also to the EFTA states. That, of course, is not the case. They need to be incorporated into the agreement. An important note is that this marking of EEA relevance is actually not a legal obligation on neither of the sides. So many of these then get discussed. You explained the role of the Registrar here that looks at acts and the assessment of the EEA relevance by the EFTA states. We do that also. So the acts that get excluded by the EFTA states, we also look at that list of acts. We consult the line DGs and legal service, and we might have some discussions on where we would disagree, but in principle there's not a lot of disagreement on these issues. Old backlog, this is a news or quiz show item in some of the EFTA states. It resurfaced again after the election, so number 650 has been mentioned all over the media in Norway at least. Yes, this is something we work on daily basis. The number grows and doesn't necessarily reflect that there's not work done behind, but also reflects increasing amount and complexity of the EU legislation that needs to be digested and brought through the EEA system. Of course, our approach is, and I'll need to mention, no cherry picking and no selective approach, and this has been made clear in talks at all the possible levels between us, and I think there's mutual understanding that this is the case. Nevertheless, we have also the old backlog. This is acts that are older than 5 years that have not yet been incorporated. There's at the moment 53 such acts, and we're focusing our work on eliminating this backlog. So there's a lot of work on this between us and also internally between the 3 EFTA states to come with proposals to us, or us suggesting proposals on how to do this. So while we'll probably talk about old backlog still in the next and for the next EEA seminar, we also see some achievements there. We have eliminated part of the energy backlog that has been incorporated in July, and we're looking forward to this to continue. So we see it as a first step, and we want to focus, of course, on the new important acts instead of spending time on old acts and cleaning that up. One thing to mention is constitutional requirements. This was also mentioned before, I think, by Karoline. So this is, of course, a prerogative under the EEA agreement that delays the entry into force of an act or a joint committee decision until it's fulfilled. In those EFTA states that notified it, but it comes into force at the same time. So in a sense, one EFTA state can delay the entry into force for all 3, but we don't have differentiated entry into force for each EFTA state. Also, this also, for example, concerns the part of the energy backlog that was incorporated in July, so we're still waiting for entry into force of that. Let me also mention that the EEA agreement mentions provisional applications, so these could actually apply provisionally, but in practice this doesn't happen, but we would be open to that. New acts, Trond mentioned digital, so for example, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, this is something that is being intensively worked on to make it fit the two-pillar system, to look at the surveillance. There's a lot of technicality behind these acts because there might be complicated IT systems, exchanges of information. Another area is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, also tremendous work going on to make that part of the EEA agreement. Green Deal acts also still some of those need to be incorporated, and there's work ongoing on that. Simplification, omnibus regulations, this was mentioned. This of course will be important once these come into force, and simplify rules on the EU side for the undertakings on our side or public administrations. You would want to make that in force also on the EEA EFTA side, obviously, exactly to ensure the homogeneity and level playing field. Another area, defense, many of these acts are actually irrelevant because they concern internal market procurement. So this will be also coming up in the coming years. And some of these have already come into force. For example, the ASAP and EDIRPA, these are acts on ammunition production and on common procurement of defense materials. So this is incorporated already in the EEA agreement, for example. When it comes to challenges, Marit mentioned the acts with horizontal concerns or cross-sectoral acts. So these are basically acts where they are rooted in internal market. Clearly the scope is within the internal market, but there are references to areas that are outside of the EEA traditionally. So they might use, for example, customs tools to perform a role in internal market or trade that you also mentioned, or could be justice and home affairs, for example, transport acts that use Prüm decisions, which is a tool under Justice and Home Affairs cooperation to exchange information. So for us, it's clear that once an act is within the scope of the EEA agreement, even if it's partially concerns the internal market, we need to find ways of incorporating that act exactly to ensure homogeneity and to find adaptations that would deal with that part that is outside of the EEA, to make it work and to have the same rules and a level playing field. So we still see this as dynamic alignment obligation being there, even if the act is sort of in between two areas. And irrespectively of the legal basis, this is also something that is being looked at when assessing the EEA relevance of acts. Again, we closely work together on these complicated issues. Of course, the three EFTA states need to come to their own position. We need to, of course, work internally to come to our position, and then find a joint solution that preserves homogeneity and level playing field. On the EEA and Norway financial mechanism, as you know, this we see as part of homogeneity and level playing field logic and package. This is something that is clearly spelled out in the EEA agreement in Article 115, where the contracting parties agree on the need to reduce economic and social disparities. And so there have been generations of these financial mechanisms. It's a contribution of the EEA EFTA states towards cohesion in the EEA. Currently, we're in the funding period from 2021 to 28. Ragnar will talk about the whole process. We're glad that the 5th MOU was signed just now with Croatia. But of course, we're 2021 to 28. It's 25, right? It's only the 5th MOU. So of course we need to, this needs to speed up. There's still time for implementation, but it's also a lesson probably for the next round of negotiations that we mutually need to start on time and finish on time. to have it ongoing when it should, and to have the benefits on the ground. Couple of words about beyond EEA agreement. As we mentioned both, it's very broad, but it doesn't cover all EU policies. We have place for extending cooperation Protocol 31 on voluntary cooperation, which, for example, covers all the programs. So programs are the voluntary cooperation, not an obligation, and that's also one area which is à la carte, as we would say. So when you look at the overview of participation of the EFTA states in programs, you will see that in some all three participate, in some just one or two. We have, for example, negotiations ongoing on EFTA states' participation in GovSatcom and Secure Connectivity Program. This is largely concluded, the negotiations, but the decision-making process is in place. We have negotiations ongoing on health crisis and response. This comes in follow-up to the COVID crisis and lessons learned in there. Part of public health is covered by the EEA agreement, so that we have the regular process of incorporation of these relevant acts. But part of the response is based on different principles on the solidarity between the EU member states, and need to make fast decisions through pooled sovereignty, and we're discussing together how we could make EFTA states part of that. And finally, coming to the end, I also need to mention fisheries relations. Fisheries, of course, is outside of the EEA agreement, but is part of the overall relations with the EFTA states. And of course, we would aim to have these mutually constructive and positive, and to avoid irritants in that area. And finally, to conclude, before we move on the seats, as this is not in me already. So we're confident and we'll find solutions to the challenges that we have. We see cooperation in good faith, and we see both political commitment to fix things and well-oiled machinery to deal with the incorporation process to bring us there. So we're looking forward to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matúš. You can just go ahead and sit right down. Now we're turning our attention to you and also those online. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to invite Marit and Trond and Karoline to come up. I'm going to have Magdalena here is going to help us with the microphone. So you have to hold it very close to your chin, just so you know. I'm going to ask you to be brief, to give us your name and the organization. And those online, you can also ask questions in the chat, and my colleague Alice here is going to send them to me. So, do we have questions? Yes, I like it. Okay, wow, we have loads. Okay, so keep it brief, and maybe we can, I think the first one was here in the back, and then we can go here to the third row. And I'm going to give you guys microphones.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jasper. I'm from Amsterdam. I'm working in the field for climate and the built environment. Makes a happy man. You talk about an equal conditions and of competition, and providing for the adequate means of enforcement in jurisdictional level. In my field, a couple of companies struggling with their business case because there's a fault in the system. It's fossil subsidies. We want to have a green environment, and we have the opposite conditions. How do you look to this, and can we delete it, because it saves a lot of time and frustration? I'm 3 days in Brussels, also the whole omnibus. I'm from Amsterdam, so we are proud of our Timmermans. He faced the created the Green Deal. Now the omnibus, what it says. Another question is, what it says about the attitude to this lovely Green Deal, and now all the omnibuses are simplification, slowing down, what it says, this attitude to this lovely Green Deal, and phasing out the subsidies and the attitude to the Green Deal in combination with the omnibuses. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Morning.
It has to be the green light. There you go.
The
nothing
green
other than
light.
it. Green deal, green light.
Thank you. From what I understood, you were basically asking about the EEA state's approach to these initiatives, such as Omnibus and the Green Deal. Yes, thank you. As our approach to this, I guess, in general, is if I'm talking on behalf of, the Secretariat, any legislation that is within the core of the agreement, that is something that we have, as we've heard this morning, we have an obligation to incorporate. I think when you look at the omnibus proposal, I think from business perspectives, and that's of course what they are explaining to us as well, better regulation is always an asset. So that is also something that we are looking into, and to the extent possible trying to contribute to the development of this work. But yeah, I mean, this is as long as it affects regulation that we are obliged through the agreement to incorporate, that is something that we will also take on.
Okay, and next question. We have a question here. Madeleine, here in the fourth row. A little bit here. And you can maybe stand up so people hear you.
Thank you. I'm Ingerid Bratz from Renewables Norway. Thank you so much for having this day. I'm not even 30 years old, so it's very good that you actually explained to us what the EEA agreement is. I have two questions, really. The first one, to everyone, really. The politicians are notably not here. We haven't really talked about the EU Parliament or the committee's role. So if you could elaborate on how you, as the Secretariat, engage with them. And then to Matúš specifically, if you could ask for one thing from the EEA EFTA states to, I don't want to say improve the relationship, but to speed up things, what specifically do you think the EEA EFTA states could do? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just on the first part of your question, so we will actually have the ambassador of Iceland open up the second half of the morning after the coffee break. So he will speak a little bit about more of the political vision, and as Marit mentioned, it's the standing committee of the states that makes sort of the daily decisions. So he will speak about that, and then our colleague Ingerid, he will also talk about the parliamentary committee, because it is really important, as you say, the political level. I don't know, Marit, do you want to add something to that?
The only thing I would like to add to that is because you were asking about the role of the Secretariat. We like to see that we are dealing with the facts and then the politicians are taking care of the politics. So, I mean, also we have just to say a word on that as well. In Brussels, we have 3 missions from our member states. They are the ones who are doing the lobby part. They are the ones who would take the EEA EFTA comments, both to the Parliament and to the member states, for instance. We may do that. We would invite them to our working groups and so on. And then I think we would just wait a bit and hear more about what Ingerid is saying about the work with the parliamentarians, but that is in general our role. It is more the facilitating the work of the EFTA states.
And then the second part of your question was how we can speed things up. Was that true?
Yes. Just to mention on the first part of the question, actually. So there's politics, of course, on our side also. When it comes to joint committee decisions where the adaptations go beyond technical, for example, on institutional issues, or when it comes to incorporation of programs into the agreement, these go before we are able to adopt it jointly. These need to go to the Council on the EU side. So not to the Parliament. The institutional setup is such that it goes through the Council, but it goes through full decision-making process on the Council side to a working party, then Coreper, Council, and only then it can be adopted. So all the member states need to be okay with those incorporations, and to speed things up. Of course, you can always, and I'm coming from an institutions that might be accused of being huge and slow and not flexible, but I think to get rid of the oldest part of the backlog that is older than 20 years, and we see it happening, So we see the light at the end of the tunnel for that particular file. That will be a great moment. And overall, of course, it's in our mutual interest. So we might be pushing for the speed, but it's also interest of the EFTA states to have this done speedily, because to have two regulatory regimes in practice, one for EU and one for the gap period for the three EFTA states, is far from ideal. So I think it's a mutual interest. Thank you.
Just one final answer to that question, because it is, of course, important that on the political level there is great collaboration. And we are very fortunate at the moment that the Commissioner Šefčovič, he has been responsible for the EEA relations for quite some time. We have ministers who work closely together, that have strong relations with the EEA. We had an anniversary conference last year where we put Šefčovič, the Belgian presidency, and our three ministers in the hot seat for 90 minutes and answering questions about the EEA, and that worked really well. So I think that we have a strong political guidance that helps with everything that comes, the sort of the processes that follow that we've been focusing on here today. Next question. We have one here and then one over here. So the gentleman here.
Good morning. It's work? Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Marit, and for everyone for this splendid seminar. I'm Rafael Radi, and I come from Brazil, and we have bases in Switzerland and Italy and Germany. My question is, last 16 September was agreement between EFTA countries and Mercosur. And now they are preparing, Macron said already that the agreement in the EU and Mercosur will work in until perhaps we have a gift until the Christmas time. My question is, how is the fundament to work the two treaties between EFTA and Mercosur and European Union and Mercosur to get together and to see an alliance to work in the laws and the work and the trade together, as example for energies or climate change in sense of renovated energy.
Thank you for that question. I think that, you know, the trade aspect of EFTA's work is handled more by our colleagues in Geneva, because here we really focus on the relations with the EU. What I would say, I mean, obviously EFTA was signing the agreement with Mercosur just last week in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. And the important thing for us and for our businesses is that if the EU-Mercosur agreement goes through the process, it is very important for our businesses to have a level playing field vis-a-vis the EU. But on the trade issues, you know, the work that we are doing here, we are not working directly on those free trade agreements. They fall outside the scope of the EEA. The EFTA states make their own agreements as an alliance when they decide to do so. They can also do bilateral agreements. We're not part of the customs union. I don't know if you want to add anything. So I think that on that side, it is more for us to ensure that our businesses have a level playing field when and if the Mercosur EU agreement goes through the process on that end. Then we have a question over here.
Thank you very much for this very informative seminar. My name is Karoline. I am a junior professional at EFTA Secretariat Statistical Office. The concern that I have is, of course, the backlog. And the question that I have is actually very much to all of the speakers. So I wanted to, for Marit and Trond and Karoline, to address where exactly does the backlog occur, as well as what are the policy topics that are usually end up in the backlog. And for Matúš, I just wanted to ask, how does this affect the backlog? How does this affect the relations between the EEA states, and whether it maybe affects potential membership of, for example, Iceland? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, of course, I think the backlog is something that is important to all of us working with the EEA agreement. I do reporting to some of these meetings every now and then, and you know, part of that is to look at the backlog and report on the backlog, because that's, of course, the core of our business. And when I look through the different, you know, if you break it down to the different areas, it is actually each and every area is maybe not so crazy big, to have said that, as of now. But it varies. I mean, sometimes we might have a little bottleneck in food chain. Sometimes we have something on energy. And as I mentioned earlier today as well, sometimes the Mother Act is challenging, it's complex. I mean, Trond would also be able to give some examples in the area connected to the digital legislation. And then all the sort of secondary and implementing act, they have to be on hold because we need the sort of overarching regulation first. So that sort of builds up a bit as well. So I think it's not necessarily one area. Of course, it's known that energy has had some issues but again, not on many legal acts, but it's all this secondary legislation. I think another area that we have seen up and coming is environment. Because of the Green Deal and because of the amount of legislation that is incorporated there. So I mean, the backlog somehow also fluctuates a bit on what areas that the EU is adopting new legal acts on.
Yeah, maybe I can add just one point, and it's not to minimize the importance of the work on reducing the backlog, but of course you've shown that there is a process to follow. The EEA agreement is not a supranational agreement. It does have a decision-making process, and so there will always be what we call the inherent backlog. It does take some time to process the acts to make them part of the agreement. So that is also a little bit a part of it, but as Marit said, I think we see occasionally that the bottlenecks do occur in relation to some areas.
Just to complement that around 3/4 of the backlog are acts, sort of natural backlog, last 2 years, let's say. Maybe that part could be also smaller, but that's the sort of the acceptable natural part. But the problem is the older part, and there also we've seen, I've mentioned it before, big achievements. For example, financial services used to be an area with a huge backlog that has been largely reduced, halved or even more. Energy has been also reduced. As you're coming from statistical office, yes, statistics surprisingly belongs to one of the bigger areas. Not a huge one, not politically sensitive, but anyway, so that's something that could and should be erased as soon as possible. And on the question on the aspect of Iceland and accession, that would be a whole new, of course, story should the negotiations be reactivated. That will be a separate process, of course, as long as Iceland is member of EEA and not member of EU or any other state. Of course, the EEA agreement applies with all the obligations and rights. Thank you.
If I may just very, very quickly as well, just to give one reflection, it is of course true that everything with the EEA agreement, and when we take in new legislation, all the 3 EEA states have to be ready at the same time. So this is of course how the agreement works, and we work a lot with that, of course, to coordinate ourselves and to be inform each other as well as we can when things are ready. But it is an important aspect that perhaps on the outside not so many people think about, but it's relevant for those files, of course, that end up being not incorporated swiftly enough, and that's
is talking about the inherent backlog. And I think also an important aspect of the backlog is, as I've been talking about today as well, the fact that it needs to fit into the agreement. It's not, I mean, the fact that it's on the backlog doesn't mean that the member states not necessarily want to incorporate it. But if you need to have a revision of laws, or if you need to do something nationally to be able to follow up those rules, that is a part of the work that has been done as well. So so that's a part of the package, let's say. So there are many elements to this famous backlog of ours.
Maybe just to add that, for example, regulations, which is a big part of the EU legislative output, are directly applicable in the EU member states, while regulations incorporated into the EEA agreement needs to be put into Norwegian, Icelandic law. In Liechtenstein, they apply directly. It's a different system. So that also adds time.
We could talk about the backlog for hours, but I'm going to say stop. Give me back the microphones. Okay, I know you guys want to go to coffee, but I'm going to we have 2 more questions here. The gentleman in the back. Yes, you in the back. Yes, you can stand up. There you go. Too many gentlemen in the back. Guys, you can sit a little bit closer, huh?
Thanks, Atanas. I've recently joined the EFTA Court as a trainee. My question is about primary law, because we have, for instance, the Charter, which also I think became a reference for the EEA EFTA pillar. But what about, for instance, Article 19 of the Treaty on the European Union? We have the Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force long after the EEA Agreement was concluded. So what about such an obligation, for instance, to have national remedies to enforce EU law? Will there be a parallel in the EFTA framework for something like that? Because you didn't speak about the Lisbon Treaty at all, and what it changed.
We have the registrar from the EFTA Court looking here very smug, seeing how we are going to answer this question. I think we're going to say, Ólafur, you can address this. We will save this question. It's a very good one, but we will save it as the first question because, you know, the ones here in the front seat who are looking at us with broad smiles are the EFTA Court and EFTA. So you're happy to take it. Yes, we will save it as the first question, which is very good because now we don't need guys don't have to worry who's the first one to ask. We will repeat this question and because you will get a good answer then, instead of us trying to figure something out. We have the last question here.
Thank you. My name is David Henry from the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group. You mentioned a couple of times this morning your trade or an agreement of some sort with the United Kingdom. So I wondered, how has the UK leaving the EU affected the work of EFTA?
That's very good. I am very glad that the Trade Division decided to send out the scouts from Geneva to make sure that we answer correctly here. Marit, do you want to answer?
Yes, well, I think the answer is actually quite short and simple. The EEA agreement is what it is. That hasn't changed, even if UK decided to leave the EU. So our work hasn't really changed at all in that sense.
With that, I think that we are all ready for a coffee break. We're going to take a 20-minute break, so we will meet again here at, well, I'm going to give you 15 minutes and we'll meet again at 40. So 11:40 back in this room. Thank you very much. And those online, get a coffee and come back. Hello? Hello, hello? Hello, hello, hello? Hello, hello, hello? Hello, hello, hello?
I see that some of you are admiring the art on the walls. So this was part of an exhibition, a temporary exhibition that the Icelandic mission installed here. We are not sure what the message is exactly, but you know, clearly there's deep discussions. People come to the table in their natural state, and there's too much plastic in the ocean. I think that's that's about it. We had a question here earlier about the political level and the political engagement. And in the first half, we focused a lot on, you know, why we have this agreement, how it works, and what we're doing concretely in our everyday practices. But obviously, we are doing this to ensure that Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway are full members of the internal market, an internal market of 30 states. And as you saw on Marit's slides, the everyday guidance and direction for the EFTA Secretariat comes from our member states directly. We are not represented by the EFTA Secretariat, does not represent our states vis-a-vis the Commission, it's our member states themselves. This is done in the Standing Committee of the EFTA states, where the ambassadors of Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway meet and make decisions. They take turns chairing that committee and the work of the Standing Committee, and I'm very pleased to have with us here today the chair, the current chair of the Standing Committee, Ambassador Stefán Jóhannesson, who is also new to Brussels, so give him an extra warm welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, dear friends of the EEA, and Ásdís, thank you for the warm welcome. Ásdís is an Icelander like myself, by the way, and I just met her the first time before this session. And as Icelanders normally do, we try to find a connection, and we found a common friend. Actually, it happened very quickly, as it usually is with us Icelanders. And this common friend of ours, he's actually a farmer, a lone farmer, a sheep farmer in a very remote area of Iceland. Great guy, highly intelligent. He's a poet, and as a typical farmer should be. But he's a strong EU and Eurosceptic, so we need to work on him, Ásdís. But it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm really encouraged to see how the turnout here, and that there are so many interested to learn more about the EEA agreement, which is hugely important. Now, every day, this market empowers 450 million people to trade, work, study, and access new resources and cultures across 30 states, namely the 27 EU member states and us 3 in the EEA EFTA, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, as you all know. And all these opportunities are made possible by a dynamic, evolving framework designed to secure our joint prosperity, the EEA Agreement. And I hasten to add that those of us that are old enough, we remember before and after EEA. And I think I can safely say that the EEA Agreement has contributed significantly to prosperity and the quality of life in Iceland. And I'm a witness to say that because I'm older than 30 years old, which is the age of the EEA Agreement. As you probably know, we celebrated the 30th anniversary and a success story last year. So to put it, yeah, and also I think we have to constantly remind us that we shouldn't, those of you that don't know life without the EEA, in particular those of you from the EEA EFTA countries, we should not take this agreement for granted. We really have to work hard to keep it going and to ensure the good functioning of this very important agreement. So, to put it simply, the EEA agreement extends the EU's internal market to Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. So to put it even more simply, we are not members of the EU, but we are part of the internal market. And I remember in the old days when, if you wanted to work or live in the continent of Europe, to get a job permit or to be able to stay there and study, it was very complicated and cumbersome. It was not easy at all. And indeed, this enables the free movement of people, goods, services, and capital across the 30 EEA states. And there are many reasons why these freedoms are so important for both the EEA states and the EU. So I would like to focus on 3 key areas that also reflect Iceland's priorities while we are chairing this cooperation. Now, first, the EEA Agreement allows businesses to thrive and citizens to seek opportunities across the entire internal market. In turn, it creates jobs, attracts investments, and strengthens value chains. But this is only possible through the efficient and predictable regulation. Rules must be predictable, and business-friendly. And therefore, the EEA states support strongly EU's ambition to simplify legislation and reduce administrative burdens as set out in the omnibus proposals. Simplification will indeed strengthen the competitiveness of the European industry. Second, the EEA cooperation can deliver on Europe's green and digital transition. Together, we are advancing collaborative research and innovation with a shared vision on economic security, climate, and competitiveness. For example, within the EFTA economies, we have some of the world's leading innovators in carbon capture and storage, a pioneering technology that will play a very important role in decarbonizing European industry. Finally, through this unique agreement, the EFTA states remain the EU's closest and most reliable partners. This solid cooperation rooted in a shared vision and values also allows us to collaborate on horizontal issues. Recent crises, such as the pandemic, Russia's war against Ukraine, and rising tariffs have exposed cracks in the global trading system and weakened confidence in multilateral cooperation. In today's shifting geopolitical landscape marked by power politics, technological rivalry, and increasing protectionism, the EEA Agreement is no longer merely an economic partnership. It is the bedrock of our cooperation with the European Union member states and our cooperation supporting most aspects of our societies, as I referred to earlier. Now, while the internal market has driven unprecedented growth over the last 30 years, it has also faced significant crises that have threatened to undermine its core values. Yet, time and again, the 30 EEA states have responded with unity, turning challenges into solutions and strengthening our shared market. Today, safeguarding Europe's economic security is one of our most pressing collective responsibilities. EU initiatives in this area are increasingly affecting our EEA partnership, making continued close dialogue with the EU essential. Economic security topped by the agenda at the EEA Council, the body charged with providing political impetus to the EEA cooperation, and will remain a key focus during Iceland's term as chair. Despite these geopolitical shifts, our day-to-day work continues in the Standing Committee. The EFTA states agree on a common position in the Standing Committee. Before then, we meet the EU side in the Joint Committee, where we take the decisions by consensus to incorporate EU law into the EEA market, and then we need to take it back home to our capitals and transpose it into our domestic legislation, be it legal changes or passing of law or regulations and so on. So this platform is vital, as internal market related EU policies only apply to the EEA states once they have been formally incorporated into the agreement by common accord, joint committee decisions as we call them. This process helps ensure that businesses and citizens across all 30 EEA states can operate on equal terms with the internal market. This principle, homogeneity, lies at the heart of the EEA agreement because a well-functioning internal market rests on a level playing field. Ultimately, as the EU develops new policies to address the emerging challenges facing the internal market, close cooperation and timely incorporation remain essential. In the face of the global challenges before us, it is reassuring to see such interest and curiosity in the EEA agreement. Long-term solutions can only emerge through effective collaboration and knowledge sharing. This is what makes meeting points like today's EEA seminar very important. These two elements are also fundamental to the overall EEA process. The EEA states must continue to work closely with the EU to ensure equal access to opportunities across all of the EEA 30 states. We must also strengthen understanding of the EEA agreement in both the EEA states and the EU. In doing so, we can unlock the full potential of our partnership and ensure it continues to deliver tangible benefits to citizens and businesses across the EEA. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So we are now going to change gears a little bit, because we've talked a lot about how we make sure that the EU law applies to the EFTA states and that we have a homogeneous market. But one thing is, of course, that we have the same rules on paper, and the other is if we have the same rules in practice. And so our next two speakers are going to look a little bit more about what happens once things are incorporated into the EEA agreement. Our job here at the Secretariat is kind of done. We have assisted the member states in incorporating the legal act, and it applies in the EEA agreement. But obviously we need to make sure that the rules are followed. And we have a sheriff in this house, Arne, who leads the college of ESA, the EFTA Surveillance Authority. So, you know, we're under strict supervision. And then, of course, we also have to make sure that there are, if disputes arise, that they can be solved. And so I'm very pleased to have with us Melpo, Joséphidès, and Ólafur Einarsson here from the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court. And they will talk a little bit more about judicial surveillance and enforcement.
Okay. Thank you. we, Melpo and I, are happy to be here. Thank Ásdís for these kind words. Of course, when their work stops, it's really when the fun begins. So we aim to discuss a little bit the enforcement, which of course is both the surveillance and the judicial control, which of course go hand in hand. And the former president of ESA used to say that although of course the court and ESA are scrupulously independent of one another, they form part of the same value chain, which is a key element and what makes the EEA agreement stand apart from all the other agreements the Secretariat-General is working with, because this is really what makes it unique. Ásdís, this should not be the next slide.
Go to the next one.
I mean, we can talk about parliamentarians, but we would struggle.
Ólafur, you just tell jokes.
Yeah. So I do.
Hey, how about you actually answer the question that we got? But then I do think, well, I fixed this. I do think we need a repeat of the question. Just for those of us all in the way in the front, we didn't really hear it. May I ask you to repeat your question from earlier?
The relations between the treaties, because the EEA agreement is from 92 and entered into force in 94. Something wrong with the mic, sorry. So since the EEA agreement predates the Lisbon Treaty, just what has changed since the Lisbon Treaty has entered into force? And what's the impact on the implementation of the EEA agreement since the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty?
I thought the question had been about Article 19 TEU.
But that's very specific. Okay.
Yeah, but that's the question I was going to answer. Okay. So.
Article 19 TEU says that there have to be national remedies also for the enforcement of...
Yeah, exactly. Let's just, while the slides are being fixed, we can discuss Article 19 TEU and how that's transposed or not into the EEA agreement. Essentially, the complete remedies the treaties foresee, I would at least argue that under the case law of the court, they are pretty much equally present in the EFTA pillar. The court has on numerous occasions applied the principle of effective judicial protection with, of course, the same subheadings of procedural autonomy and principle of effectiveness as in the EU. The rule of law has been a feature in I would say a handful of cases under the EFTA court, so that aspect of it is probably there already. We have not had a rule of law crisis in the EFTA pillar, thank God, I would say. So sort of the impact of Article 19 on the judiciary in the EFTA pillar is unexplored, but I hope we'll never have to explore it. And then, of course, you alluded to the Charter, and that gives me a wonderful opportunity to promote the breakout session on judicial enforcement and surveillance in the afternoon, where we will discuss the Charter a bit and other interesting issues. And, yeah, I just invite everyone to join us. And are the slides now working?
Let's hope.
Let's hope.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Melpo Joséphidès, and I'm the director at the EFTA Surveillance Authority. We are the, I would say, the investigator. I wouldn't call us the sheriff, because we abide by the rule of law. This is a legal construction that has been agreed between the EFTA states and the EU member states and the EU institutions to have this internal market extended to the EEA. So we don't wildly go after one or the other state. We are following the same procedures that the Commission follows when being guardian of the treaties. We are the guardians of the EEA Agreement. And we remain, as any sheriff also I hope would remain, under the control of the EFTA Court. So anything we do in relation to ensuring that the states comply with is ultimately judged by the EFTA Court. Maybe a bit about the architecture. The EEA agreement establishes this cooperation that extends the internal market and provides for these independent institutions, the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court. It is important to note that it's the three states together that have the surveillance and court agreement and define the rules by which they decide on their own to apply the same procedures as on the EU side. And that's why we have what we call the two-pillar structure. You've been talking about it in the morning earlier. And what we have been looking at this morning was mostly the part in the middle, the common institutions. And so I invite you to focus on the part where we can see the princely castle in Liechtenstein in the middle. There you see the princely castle because there is no common institution when it comes to enforcement. It is separate institutions, separate for each pillar. So us at ESA, we do the work of the Commission as guardian of the treaties, and the EFTA Court does the equivalent of what the Court of Justice does. And the fact that the pillars are separate doesn't mean that the tracks are only parallel. We do talk to each other a lot. Matúš spoke this morning about the surveillance policy dialogue. This is something that we started some years ago with the current college, whereby we bring together the expertise on the methodology we use to look into how EEA law is applied in the states, how we go about having a dialogue with the states. Are there any tips and tricks to get compliance? Because ultimately our mission is not to go after the states. Our mission is really to have the same rules apply in the same manner across the EEA. So we want to learn from the Commission's experience, and we hope that the Commission also learns from our experience dealing with states that are very open to us about how they interpret the rules and how they apply them in practice. So these are the three college members. Like in the Commission, at the top of our organization is a college, each of them appointed, nominated by one of the each state and appointed together as the authorities college, which means that they take decisions collectively and they share the responsibility for their decisions. It is very useful to have the expertise and the background from each of the states, but when looking at which cases to pursue and what the next steps should be, it is really the interest of the EEA agreement that primes, because our college is independent and does not take instructions from the states.
Then turning to the EFTA Court, the EFTA Court is also composed of three, and it's rather, in that sense, rather unique. It's three judges. The court always sits as full court, and it's always the same judges. The EFTA Court is based in Luxembourg, and it's the only international court in the world based in a state which is not a contracting party to the convention setting up the court, because as Melpo said, there is both the EEA agreement and then there is the surveillance and court agreement between the EFTA states, which sets up ESA and the court, and their competences and jurisdiction derive from that agreement, not the EEA agreement itself. However, of course, the court's competence is to interpret EEA law, and that encompasses both. This largely corresponds to what the Court of Justice does on the other side. There are nuances. For example, the EFTA Court sits as, in direct action cases, as the first and last instance. There is no appeal like from the General Court to the Court of Justice. The nomination process follows the same process as on the EU, that each state nominates one judge and they are then appointed by a common accord of all the EFTA states. This mirrors the EU procedure on this.
So how does ESA, the investigator, investigate? First, we monitor the situation in the states. We follow the legislation that is being applied. We watch the news, understand how things work in practice in the state. We also benefit from obligations to inform us, so reporting obligations that the states have agreed to when incorporating acts into the EEA agreement. So if they have to tell us how they are protecting the environment in a certain area, then that comes with preparing plans that they need to inform us about. So we do receive information in the same way as the Commission does by being the recipient of reports. We carry out conformity assessments. That is a bit of a barbaric word to say that we look at one area of EEA legislation and ask specific questions to the 3 states in parallel about how they have put that into their national law and how they apply it in practice. For that, we have a bit of a competitive disadvantage compared to the Commission because of the delay in incorporation. Which is natural to some extent. So when the EU adopts new legislation, a new directive, then there will be immediately after its adoption a whole machinery set up to help the member states implement that correctly. So usually that work gets finished by the time this comes into the EEA agreement. So we kind of miss the train at the station. It will already have left when we start in ESA to do the same conformity assessment in some cases. That's not to say we don't benefit from the experience on the EU side, because the Commission will have gathered all the experience from 27 national traditions of how to do things. And very often we see similarities in the choices made by our states, especially with their close neighbors. So things do look familiar, and we are able, thanks to the surveillance policy dialogue and to the good cooperation between case handlers that Matúš referred to learn from the experience. Ultimately, the objective is really to apply the same rules in the same manner and to look at the same issues as on the EU side. We also receive complaints. Anyone can complain to ESA because if they think that their rights have not been respected or they think the state doesn't apply EEA law correctly. We, of course, like in the Commission, don't have capacity to deal with all cases, and it's a matter of prioritization. But it is also a very good source of information for us as to the type of issues that can be recurrent, that we sometimes choose to package and deal under an own initiative case. So if we know there might be a problem on the ground in one or the other area, we don't necessarily entertain all the complaints in that area. We often close them and inform the complainants that we will be taking it up on our own initiative, and we'll be using the information we receive in the process. So another set of barbaric words that are very technical. The LFN, so that's the letter of formal notice, the reasoned opinion, and then the court stage. These are the 3 stages where we first start to look into the issue and have informal contacts with the ministries to understand how they apply, how they interpret the law. If we think that what we found is not compliant with EEA law, then we will send a letter of formal notice. That is a college decision adopted at the highest level in ESA, where we set out why we think the state is not complying and asking for an answer to that and a chance to respond. That's the best way to resolve matters, because sometimes there might be things that we will have missed, and it's an opportunity also for the state to convince us that we haven't been looking at things in the right way. If after the state's answer we're still convinced that the legislation or the practice in that state is not compliant, then we reach the last stage within ESA, which is to issue a reasoned opinion, where we ask the state to comply, or if they don't comply within the deadline, we take the matter to the EFTA court, and then the EFTA court becomes the judge of what EEA law entails in terms of obligations and whether we have proven that the state is not in compliance with those obligations.
The next slide is a quote from at least arguably the court's most famous case. So if you haven't read it. This is cases, and we swapped so I can get to pronounce Sveinbjörnsdóttir. And it says that the EEA agreement is an international treaty sui generis. Here it shows that the judges like to add some Latin flavor to. But in a way, it is here. Often using Latin is maybe not appropriate, but I think here it makes some sort of sense because it is sort of emphasizes the uniqueness, and this judgment really shows that the EEA agreement is way beyond something which is normal under international law, but not quite EU law, which sort of makes it very complicated, and is so a distinct legal order of its own. So in this judgment, the EFTA Court established that the same principle of state liability for breaches of EU or EEA law is equally applicable to the EFTA states. And this was really a seminal moment for the EEA agreement, and it sort of reaffirmed that this is really a special agreement which extends the internal market and goes way beyond the previous free trade agreements the EFTA states had with the Union, or then community. A little bit about the EFTA Court. So here, we've mentioned before, and Melpo was also emphasizing it, that the EU had and the EFTA states agreed in the EEA, the EFTA states have to set up a surveillance authority and the Court of Justice. So that's the SCA. Then that grants the court jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction of the court is interpretation of EEA law, and that is broader than just the EEA agreement. It's also, for example, the SCA, and there are important rules, for example, on ESA's competence in the field of state aid, which are then regulated in the SCA. So the court is competent for both. There is a difference between the EU that the EFTA Court does no jurisdiction on validity. So if an act is incorporated into the EEA agreement by the EEA Joint Committee, the EFTA Court cannot rule and say, we believe this act is incompatible with the fundamental right to privacy. It might well be, but the EFTA Court has not been granted that competence. So that is a sort of, if you're into the nuances of the different jurisdictions, this is an important point to bear in mind. The case the EFTA Court hears are essentially twofold. We have the advisory opinion, which are requests from national courts, whereby they have a case pending which raises an issue of EEA law, and then they refer a question to the EFTA Court, how is particular provision of the EEA agreement to be interpreted, and the EFTA Court answers that, which is then applied to the facts by the national court. This is a very important procedure, and the case Sveinbjörnsdóttir, which I mentioned, and most of the seminal cases of the court have arisen via this route, which is the same experience as on the EU side. Then we have the direct actions, and they first here, then we have sort of the final piece of the puzzle of Melpo's previous slides, the third stage, the court stage. ESA has been engaged first in a dialogue, then in more formal correspondence with the states. That is unresolved, and then that leads to proceedings in front of the court where ESA seeks a declaration that the state breached EEA law. And then we have another type of direct actions, and that is then if there ESA is also a key player, but on the other side, there ESA takes a decision, most typically in the field of state aid, which then one of the states or an undertaking dissatisfied with the outcome brings review proceedings in front of the EFTA Court, which then examines whether ESA's decision holds up to scrutiny. So these are the different cases, and again, we will examine this more in detail later. Then there's one aspect we'd like to highlight, and that both the EFTA Court and ESA are quite transparent in their workings, and I would say more transparent than is usual for such institutions. The EFTA Court streams all its hearings, so they're live streamed. So any hearing is available on our website, and we've also, this started during COVID, but the court has kept this going, so it's now been over 5 years with all hearings streamed. This also means that the court allows for remote participation. So if someone wants to plead remotely, that is acceptable. And finally, the written observation in advisory opinions, they are now made public, and not only after the judgment has been rendered, which is the situation on the EU side after the latest changes to the Court of Justice Rules of Procedure, but in advance of the hearing. So in advisory opinion, all written observations submitted will be available a few days in advance of the hearing to really show that this is what has been submitted to the court and will be presented at the hearing. The same goes for ESA. I will just mention this briefly, that ESA has rules on access to documents which are inspired by the EU rules, but in their application go further, because the infringement cases, the documents related to the infringement cases, are by and large available on ESA's website. So you have lots of interesting letters of formal notice and reasoned opinion, which are very, very much worth reading. So, so this, I think, is maybe not so highlighted, but I think is nevertheless a very important aspect of these institutions' work. And then I'll leave Melpo with a special relationship, which doesn't involve Donald Trump.
Special relationship, it's not just a political term, it's also a legal term. It's a term that has been used by the Court of Justice of the EU, and it has legal consequences. So this means that the Court of Justice, and also now lately the EFTA Court, have recognized that our states are bound, or the three EFTA states are bound with the EU and with the EU member states by multiple agreements. The EEA agreement is by far the largest and the biggest one in terms of the scope of the EEA agreement, but there is also other agreements on civil cooperation, on arrest warrant and recognition of judicial decisions. So all of that makes up for a special relationship that grants, within the scope of the EEA agreement, grants EEA nationals the same rights whether they come from EFTA or from the EU. So the basis for this is this objective of homogeneity, a result that is one of the objectives of the EEA agreement. The EEA agreement is there to ensure that the same rules apply across the EEA within the scope of the internal market. And the reason why this result is possible is also because our states have the same basis as the EU member states in terms of respect of fundamental rights. There can be a very interesting legal debate. We mentioned that in the question earlier about the absence of a Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EEA agreement. The truth is that since the beginning, the EFTA Court recognized that general principles of EEA law include the protection of fundamental rights, in the same way that the Court of Justice did that in the 70s for the EU. So the same underlying protection of fundamental rights is there, and so people are guaranteed that their obligations and rights under the EEA agreement will be based on the same foundations. Lately, the EFTA Court, in the latest judgment that is mentioned under the second bullet point, the EFTA Court has also underlined that the Charter, because of its relevance and the EU pillar, could also, its provisions could also be used, or could be relevant in interpreting the case law, the EEA law, on our side. For more details on that, I invite the aficionados to join Ólafur and Sigrun, who is here in the room for the afternoon session. It's a very interesting discussion on the legal technicalities of the EEA agreement. But what I want the message to be here today is that no matter what route you take, you land in the same place when it comes to the basics of the cooperation between the EEA states, between them. And how does the special relationship work? Well, it works with mutual trust, which is, again, a legal concept. It's the legal concept that is behind concepts like mutual recognition of administrative decisions across our states. So our states have put together, have so much cooperation that they've also agreed to recognize that other states will grant equal protection and will guarantee the rights of their own nationals in the same way that they would do themselves. So this mutual trust also has consequences on how the rights of people are affected throughout the EEA. These are obviously subjects for a long discussion, so I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Melpo and Ólafur. I'm actually going to open up for questions here in the room. If anyone has questions for our representatives from the court and from ESA. Yes, we have one question here.
Thank you. My name is Monica Stansland. I work at Norway's mission to the EU, and I feel like I should know the answer to the question I'm about to ask you, but I'll try and get anyway. When you showed the two-pillar structure, you pointed out that there's no joint body that marries the EU side and the EEA side, the EFTA EEA side, when it comes to surveillance and enforcement. And so you have a surveillance authority and a court that is meant to survey and enforce the same legislation as the EU bodies in the same way. Has it ever happened, or how do you prevent it from happening, that your court decides differently on the same legislation compared to what the EU court decides? How do you deal with that? Because at least there's a theoretical possibility that that could happen. Thank you.
I think it's for you. Yeah, it's for me. Yeah, I mean, let's just, if we roll back, there was, of course, maybe Stefán Haukur was already at the ministry when they were negotiating. Then there was supposed to be the EEA court in the middle, the Court of Justice, and Knut probably as well. Yeah, the EEA court was struck down by the Court of Justice as being incompatible with the autonomy of community law. So this, of course, is a dilemma, and the EFTA court is very much aware of this dilemma and has addressed it in a case called L'Oréal. And there, the basic, to cut a long story short, the EFTA court has said there is international exhaustion of trademark under the Trademark Directive. The Court of Justice says, no, there is EEA-wide exhaustion. The Oslo District Court was understandably rather perplexed by this state of affairs and asked the EFTA court, and the EFTA court essentially aligned its case law. It said, if we have said A, the Court of Justice says B, we will have to examine, are there any EEA-specific grounds which justify our ruling, and in the absence of that, we will align. And in that particular case, the court examined, for example, IP rights and third country relations and said they are regulated in the same manner, so we will align.
If I may complement from a very practical perspective, we try to play a little part in this with this problematic. We try to, when we intervene in cases along with our states at the Court of Justice, we try to bring the case law of the EFTA court to the Court of Justice and set it out there. So there is a formal transmission mechanism. We hope to facilitate that. And the other way around, when we are in front of the EFTA court, we of course rely on the case law of the Court of Justice to submit to the EFTA court how we would suggest to approach an issue. And if I may say, from what we see from the EFTA court, the methodology for interpretation and the principles that are applied are largely the same. So it is a risk that is embedded in the system, and it has materialized in the past. But thanks to the very good dialogue between the courts, formal and informal, and these mechanisms of transmission, we can hope that it doesn't arise very often, and that it doesn't matter which court you go to, you would get the same answer as to how to interpret a certain provision.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, then we'll have to move along.
Thank you very much. Isaac Levitt of Swedish law firm Vinge. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this concept which you briefly mentioned of how the EU institutions listen to your work and transpose what you do into EU law. For instance, do you have any novel case law examples or legal strategy examples which the EU court or the EU Commission would copy from you?
Me too. I mean, the best example is quite an old one, but really is basically Norway and Denmark. This is around the turn of the century, had imposed the same restrictions on fortified Kellogg's. ESA started infringement proceedings. The Commission started infringement proceedings. ESA got there first. So the EFTA court ruled that Norway had been in breach, and then about a year later, the Court of Justice reached the same conclusion and relied heavily, because this was at a period when the precautionary principle was being developed, and the EFTA court did quite a bit of there are extensive passages in the EFTA court's judgment on that, which then were cited heavily in the corresponding infringement case against Denmark. I think that sort of is the high watermark of this. There's also quite, if we take the competition law and the standard of review, then there's a case called Posten Norge where ESA fined Posten, I think 2009 or 10, judgment from the EFTA court from 2012. That has been cited with several general court judgments on that issue. These are sort of maybe at the top of my head, the best examples I can give you.
Thank you. I know that these two can talk for hours, and there's a lot of drama here to unpack. But that we will say for the breakout session that is not live streamed, you know. So there we can talk a little bit more openly. Thank you both so much. And do consider the breakout session in the afternoon. Just to show you again the slides, since Ólafur was going back and forth. And now it is time to talk a little bit more about the broader discussion. We have talked a lot about our process, and obviously within corporation we are working a lot with the governments, but the EEA has an impact on our societies as a whole. You know, they impact the legislation of the working market, they have a wide impact on the political arena, and that is why it is very important for us, and you already saw it in Marit's slide, that we have what we call the advisory bodies. We have the parliamentary committee of EFTA, we have the consultative committee with both employers and employees associations, and there is an EEA angle to their work. And to explain that a little bit more, we have with us Ingerid Bratz, who is the officer of the parliamentary committee.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ingerid Bratz. As Ásdís mentioned, I'm the officer to the Parliamentary Committee. I work in the EEA Coordination Division. Today, I have the pleasure of providing a presentation on the parliamentarians, the social partners, and the local and regional authorities, also known as the EFTA advisory bodies, and their role in the EEA cooperation. For my agenda, I will start by focusing on the role and the mandate of the EFTA advisory bodies, followed by parliamentary scrutiny through the social partners, from the local and regional authorities, and finally to look at some recent topics of interest to the advisory bodies. I think it's useful to start by looking at the origins of the EFTA advisory bodies and their history. So as you know from today, the EEA Agreement entered into force in 1994, but EFTA as an organization has existed for longer. So in 1960, EFTA came into being, and it was decided at the time to establish two advisory bodies. So in 1961, the EFTA Consultative Committee was established, and in 1977, the EFTA Parliamentary Committee was also established. These advisory bodies are structured under the EFTA Council, which is the highest governing body of EFTA. And as you see here, they directly feed into the work, so they advise the member states. Now, the advisory bodies, who are they and what is their role? Well, we have, as I mentioned, the Parliamentary Committee, which is a forum for parliamentarians from the member states, so politicians. And then you have the EFTA Consultative Committee, members of trade unions, employers' associations, and businesses in the EFTA countries. Now, what is their role? Well, their role is to advise the member states on all matters falling within the scope of EFTA. They also provide a link and a channel of information between the parliaments and the institutions, both in the EFTA countries, with the EU, and worldwide. In many ways, we can say that the EFTA advisory bodies, they wear two hats. And we say that because their mandate is to provide advice and scrutiny on one, relations with the EU, so the EEA Agreement, but secondly, relations with third countries, so EFTA's trade policy. As you see here on the map, EFTA has, since the 1990s, established an extensive network of free trade agreements worldwide. You want me to higher? I'm taller. Thank you. They have over 30 free trade agreements signed to date. I think, Ásdís, you said 35. And you also mentioned that they recently signed with Mercosur and Malaysia. So this is one hat, one of the key issues that the advisory bodies, they follow. But then there's also the second hat, which is what we're talking about today, the EEA Agreement. And you've seen this figure before. It's a two-pillar structure. You have the EFTA pillar, the EU pillar, and then the joint pillar in the middle. And at the bottom, you see the advisory bodies represented. In the middle, again, you see the EEA Joint Parliamentary Committee, which is where we have members from the European Parliament and from the EFTA countries meeting together. And you have the EEA Consultative Committee, which is the same principle. You have the EU side and the EFTA side, and they meet together in the middle. So this is very much the framework of the advisory bodies and how they work with the EEA Agreement. Now moving over to parliamentary scrutiny of the EEA. So we have the EEA Joint Parliamentary Committee, which is the forum, as I mentioned, with EFTA MPs and members of the European Parliament from the delegation responsible for relations with EFTA. It's a forum where the MPs and MEPs can monitor the implementation of the EEA Agreement, which is important because, as you know from today, EEA-relevant legislation incorporated into the agreement will have a legislative impact at home. So the JPC, it fosters democratic oversight and accountability of the EEA work. And while they're not directly involved in the decision-making process, this is a forum for them to debate topics of relevance to the internal market and to discuss the wider EEA cooperation. Just to go a little bit deeper into the meetings of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, it's important to note that the committee carefully select the topics that they want to discuss in their meetings. They meet twice per year, once in an EFTA state and once in Strasbourg at the seat of the European Parliament. And what they're interested in discussing is EU legislation under negotiation or in the decision-making process that may enter into the EEA Agreement. It then contributes to a better understanding between the EU and the EFTA states about the areas covered by the agreement. They also often discuss broader issues of relevance to the internal market, and they are interested in inviting external guests and speakers, and often rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs to provide briefings on specific files. Trond earlier today talked about decision shaping and the EEA EFTA comments, and this is another useful way for the parliamentarians to convey the views to the European Parliament side. So then they know the views of the member states and they can come in the meetings and present the EFTA perspective. So overall, that really helps to ensure that the EFTA view is taken into account also in these meetings. Some recent topics that they've discussed is, for example, the AI Act. They've discussed CBAM, they've discussed the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, and also wider initiatives linked to the EU's current agendas of competitiveness, simplification, and so on. Ultimately, they are able to bring knowledge back home and provide a link between political life in the EU and in the EFTA countries. Now over to the oversight role of the social partners. So from the pillar, you also saw the EEA Consultative Committee, which consists of members from the EFTA Consultative Committee and from the European Economic and Social Committee. They essentially ensure that the social partners have a voice in the EEA. It's not just the parliamentarians.
They are interested then in monitoring the economic and social aspects, for example, labor market policy, education, social issues, skills, and so on. It also promotes dialogue and more democratic legitimacy, since the social partners are then also able to scrutinize the functioning of the agreement. Finally, we also have the EEA EFTA Forum, which is perhaps less known but equally important. And I say that because you may not know, or you may do, but roughly 2/3 of EU legislation is implemented at this level. So this forum was established in 2009 by the EFTA Standing Committee, in a sense aimed to mirror the Committee of Regions on the EU side. It consists of elected representatives from the local and regional authorities. And while it's not an official part of the EEA agreement, it very much operates and provides input, also another channel to the Standing Committee. It consists of Iceland and Norway. Switzerland are observers, and Liechtenstein has for the moment not opted to join. They formalize their views in opinions, written opinions addressed to the Standing Committee. They recently published on the urban wastewater and public procurement, which are issues that you can imagine have a huge impact on this level. Finally, I also want to discuss a few topics of interest to the advisory bodies to connect it a little bit to the present moment. I should also note that the advisory bodies, they regularly meet with the ministers. In June, they meet with the EFTA trade ministers, the one hat advising on trade matters, and then they meet with the foreign ministers in November to discuss EEA matters. Some of the issues they've been interested in recently is, of course, linked to the current geopolitical context and the impact on the EEA, sparked by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, wider trade issues, and the current turbulent context. They're also very interested in European competitiveness and the future of the internal market, referencing the Draghi and Letta reports. And of course also the green and digital agendas related to artificial intelligence and climate change, and finally security and defense matters, increased defense spending, and a new security context evolving. So all in all, it gives them an opportunity to discuss within the EFTA family when they meet with the ministers and to present their views and exchange opinions, which is very useful to ensure a better democratic accountability. So one of the key messages I want you to take away from today's presentation is that the advisory bodies, in many ways, they have a bird's eye view. And here we have put in a picture of the beautiful EFTA house to illustrate that. It's because, as I mentioned, they are able to scrutinize and advise the member states on all matters relevant to EFTA, and they form a bridge between parliaments and institutions. They also ultimately then can bring all of the EFTA matters closer to the citizens of the EFTA states, ensuring democratic accountability and legitimacy over EFTA and the EEA and their policies. Thank you very much, and I also have a workshop later with some colleagues on decision shaping if you're interested in learning a bit more.
Thank you, Ingrid. Sorry, thank you, Ingrid. I'm actually going to have to ask Ragna. Is Ragna Fitz still here from the EEA Norway grants in the room? No? Then I think that she must just have needed to step outside for a brief moment. I think with that, even though we will then welcome Ragna when she comes in, maybe Knut, could you summarize a little bit what we've heard so far? And then when Ragna comes back, we will give the floor to her. No, she's here, Good. So one of the key words that you heard today, we have heard a lot about homogeneity, we have heard a lot about the backlog, but another key word is cohesion. It is that we want an internal market that is strong together. We want our member states to be economically and socially strong. And here to talk about the EEA Norway grants, I'm very pleased to have with us Ragna Fitzdal. She's the Managing Director of the EEA and Norway grants here in the House. Ragna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. I was just next door waiting for my turn. Yes. You might know that the EU cohesion policy was put in place to make the internal market function properly by reducing regional disparities and promoting a balanced development to ensure that all regions could benefit from the single market. And when the 3 EFTA member states became part of the internal market through the EEA Agreement, the question also came up about contributing to this cohesion efforts from their side. So it was agreed already in the EEA Agreement that there would be a financial mechanism that would contribute to cohesion in the same way as the EU funding was, so complementary to what the EU was doing themselves. So this is linked to the EEA Agreement, the Articles 115 to 117, and in a separate protocol to the agreement, and that is updated regularly as well. During the first 10 years of the participation in the EEA, these funds were channeled through the European Investment Bank with not so much involvement from the donor states. But everything changed in 2004 when you had a big enlargement and all the new EU member states joining. And that was also the moment where FMO, this Secretariat for the EEA and Norway grants, was established as a part of EFTA. And then the donors became much more active in establishing the policies for what should be funded, and they also saw their own strategic interest in taking part in this cooperation. So from the start, it was really to contribute to the consolidation and the capacity of the new member states to take fully part in the enlarged European economic area and the internal market. So from the start, it was very much focused on funding environmental protection, reduction of pollution, human resource development, such as health and education, and also the Schengen acquis and the justice sector, and regional policies. This was based on the needs in these countries, but also based on the expertise and the interest the donor states had. And in 2009, it became really interesting because then when they negotiated the new protocol, I guess it must have been Protocol 38B, an objective was added to the purpose of this funding, that it should also be used to strengthen the bilateral relations between the donor states and the beneficiary states. And then, of course, the grants became a part of a foreign policy tool, and it has facilitated thousands of partnerships between entities in the beneficiary state and the donor states. We have a number of research institutions, private sector, public institutions, NGOs, municipalities and regions taking part in concrete projects in the beneficiary states. And they are working on issues that address common European challenges, such as biodiversity, climate change, health preparedness, European research, anti-discrimination, combating international crime, just to mention a few areas, because it's a very broad scope with these grants. And this cooperation, this bilateral cooperation, has become maybe our strongest comparative advantage when you look at other funding mechanisms available. Because we are not only providing funding, but also partnerships where programs and projects are developed and implemented together. And that allows for innovation, learning, transfer of expertise, and internationalization for both sides that both parties benefit from. So if you compare this funding from the EEA states with the EU unfunding, it represents maybe only 1% of the total cohesion funds. But this bilateral dimension distinguishes from the main EU model. The EU and the common market, of course, is built on the member states' strong commitment to respect for common fundamental values related to rule of law. And this is also the basis for a well-functioning common market. There needs to be trust in the judiciary, freedom from corruption, respect for workers' rights, etc. And democracy and social inclusion is the key to upholding the European project. Since the beginning, there has been a strong focus on these values in the EEA and Norway grants. on inclusion of marginalized group, support to civil society, equality, etc. But what we see now is that these values and democratic values such as freedom of association, free speech, media freedom, and also this new area of disinformation, information integrity, is coming under, putting the values under pressure, and these values are more relevant and crucial than ever. And in line with EU also putting more emphasis on rule of law and conditionality, these aspects have been further strengthened in the current agreement we have with the EU, the protocol, and in the legal framework for implementing the EEA Norway grants. In theory, the funding periods of the EEA Norway grants should follow the multi-annual financial framework periods, but we experience some delays, more and more, for each funding period. I'm not looking at you. Because it takes time to agree both on the text and the financial contribution. And that means that the current agreement that should be aligned with the financial framework of 21 to 27 was only signed in September 24 and adopted by the EU Parliament in April this year. So now we are working really, really hard to catch up on the delays and get all the necessary systems in place, and then agree with the countries on which programs we are going to develop in each beneficiary states. And this shows also the map of the 3 donor states and who is benefiting from these funds. It's basically all the EU member states who joined after 2004, as well as Portugal and Greece. When it comes to this new funding period, we are done in the process of establishing the total program. There are 3 overarching thematic priorities that has been defined in the agreement with the EU, namely green transition, democracy, rule of law and human rights, as well as resilience and social inclusion. And this reflects very much the challenges we see in Europe today. But we are building on 20 years of cooperation and strong bilateral relations and trust that has been built over this year. So it's also a lot of continuity in the kind of programs we are working on. But it also allows us this long-term partnerships we have built. It allows us to work also in areas that can be a bit challenging and sensitive, but which are very important to creating cohesive societies. And one notable fact as well with the new priorities is this strong focus on resilience, which also shows a little bit where Europe is today when it comes to dealing with crisis, dealing with climate change and increased global tensions. So all the programs we develop will contribute to one or several of these thematic priorities. The model we use for the grants is a program approach, where programs are implemented by operators in the beneficiary states. And we have developed, the donor states have developed a long menu, which we call the Blue Book, showing that we are working almost in all sectors of society. And these areas were first agreed with the EU in the protocol, and then further developed by the donor states in consultation with the beneficiary states. And we also had a completely open public hearing. So in this Blue Book, we describe what are the objectives of the programs and what are the kind of activities that can be supported. And based on this menu, there are concrete negotiations with each one of the 15 beneficiary states on which programs they will implement, the budgets allocated, eventual partners, and specific focus. So far, we have signed with 5 of these countries, Croatia this week, and the others will come during the autumn. Next step when we have signed an agreement is to develop the concrete programs with inputs from partners in the donor states and with the help from our Secretariat, the FMO. And then they will start implementing the programs once the donors have approved them. with call for proposals and predefined projects sometimes. So we expect that this will be launched more or less in 27-28 for most of the programs. That's when people can apply for funding. The allocation is set in the agreement with the EU, and that is based on a formula. It's the same they use in the cohesion funds. So you can see that it's a big difference between the countries. Poland is by far the largest, and Malta has a tiny allocation compared to the rest. I would also like to mention, in addition to the allocations going directly to the countries, there are some funds managed directly by the donor states. And the Civil Society Fund, that is actually 10% of the total amount, more than 300 million euros in the 15 beneficiary states. These are managed completely independently from governments. So the FMO is contracting fund operators that are part of a bid process. And this has really become one of the trademarks of the EEA and Norway grants. We are the single largest funder of NGOs working on democracy and human rights issues in these countries. And they also tell us that we have been a lifeline for many of these organizations to survive, particularly now that the US and other donors are withdrawing. Of course, we have appreciated very much the EU program SERVE that also came in and worked a bit along the same model as us. So we more than welcome other actors in this field. But we see that this is really an important part of the funding that makes a difference in Europe. We have also a fund working with international partners. It's 2% of the funding, and we have strategic partnerships with the Council of Europe, with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, and with the OECD. And there we are working on very topical and interesting projects as well, such as initiatives to preserve civic space, information integrity, gender-based violence, anti-corruption, human rights institutions, green governance, gender mainstreaming, access to justice, Roma inclusion, etc. Some of these areas that might be difficult to work directly with the countries on will be reinforced by having these partnerships with international organizations. The international organizations are both managing multi-annual regional projects in this area themselves, but they are also taking part as advisor and partners in the programs run by the beneficiary states. And lastly, there is a Norwegian fund, because there are two mechanisms supporting social dialogue, working with the labor and trade unions and employers organizations, as well as with the government in this area of social dialogue. So I know that you are waiting for your lunch, so I wanted to be short, but I just would like to point you to our webpage, and we have a very nice project portal where you can actually go in and find information about all the projects we have been funding for several periods now. Last funding mechanism, we had more than 7,000 projects and initiatives. And actually now out in the area up on the balcony, you might find some of my colleagues with some fancy virtual reality equipments where you can go and visit the project in Cyprus. It's an interesting project we have been supporting for a long time. So I would really recommend that, so you get a feeling of one of the 7,000 projects we have been funding for the last period. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. So this brings us to the end of our discussion today. I am going to come back because for those online, it is the end of the day. For those of us here in the house, I hope it's only halfway through. And we will now get into the juicy stuff in the breakout sessions. But first, I will come back just to give you a little bit about the practicalities. And you will all have to fill out a two-pillar structure sheet to be able to get your lunch. So I hope you've been paying attention. To wrap up the substantive discussion here today, I'm very glad that we have with us Knut Hermansen. He is the Deputy Secretary-General here at the EFTA Secretariat. Knut, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ásdís. I would like to first of all thank you all for coming here today. I'm really happy to see that there are so many interested in how the EEA cooperation actually works. I would like to thank you who participate physically here at the Secretariat, but of course also those participating online. And I think the turnout here today really shows that the agreement, the EEA agreement, is still, after more than 30 years of operation, an important instrument with regard to the cooperation and relations between the EEA EFTA states and the EU side. And I would like to say that the EEA cooperation has a solid support in the EEA EFTA states. It creates, as we have heard in several interventions today, it creates a homogeneous market, level playing field, and it provides market access and the necessary predictability, not only for economic operators and the industries, but also for citizens, who may work, live, and study all over Europe. And I would like also to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers, in particular the external speakers, Ambassador Jóhannesson, and also our friend and colleague Matúš Minárik from the European Commission. And I would also like to thank the internal speakers that has shared their knowledge about the EEA cooperation here today. A lot of information, you have heard a lot of information today, and I know that it is very difficult to absorb everything. I think that all the presentations will be available on our website, so you can go back and see and to recollect what has been said here today. So that is fine. And I also hope that you have found this seminar interesting. I hope you have found the topics both useful and helpful in your daily work. We will now go to our lunch. After lunch, you will have the breakout sessions where you can dive even further into the details of all issues that we are dealing with here at the Secretariat. With this, I just give the floor back to Ásdís. Thank you.
Thank you, Knut. Just a few pointers. We will now have lunch here in the canteen where we had the coffee break. We will have that until about 5 minutes to 2. Then I'm going to ask you to go into the breakout sessions. Honestly, you can't go wrong because, you know, every single session is going to be led by someone who has a passion for what they're going to be talking about. And these breakout sessions, we do them because we want to create an opportunity for you to have smaller groups and more discussions, more dialogue with our presenters. In this room, we will have how EU law becomes EEA law. It is a beginner session. The one on the fun legal processes. I mean, there's so many lawyers in here, so you all think all legal processes, of course, are fun, but this one will be even more so. We will also have an advanced session on the two-pillar structure and the challenges that we face in bringing in, you know, the modern-day technology and legislation into this pillar. That will be led here. You go up the stairs just where you came in, and they are right on the right side. We will have someone there to explain to you. Just opposite here, the legal drama, the judging Amy part of the seminar with Ólafur and Sigrún Ingibjörg Gísladóttir, who is deputy of Melpo at the EFTA Surveillance Authority. And then up on the 5th floor, there's the policy session, how the EEA EFTA states and the Secretariat work on shaping EU policy while it's in the drafting stage. It will be led by Trond, that you saw earlier, but also Peter Gunnarsson, who is the head of our policy division, and Ingerid from the parliamentary committee, and her counterpart from the consultative committee. So honestly, you chose two when you registered. And you should have an email with those sessions. If you don't remember, you've changed your mind, just pick one, but maybe give priority to those that had selected the session before. And if you have any questions, come to us. Be ready with your two-pillar in mind, and let's break for lunch. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the first half.